After failing in life and a major violin competition, a talented musician gives up on her dream completely. Music had only brought her pain in her old life. But after accidentally falling down the stairs, she wakes up in another world filled with knights and magic. Her arrival goes horribly wrong, and she's immediately accused of being a spy. But at least in this world, her violin playing can restore mana, heal allies, and support entire armies. For the first time in her life, the music she almost abandoned becomes truly valuable. Fudo Masumi was once told that her violin playing was completely empty, that there was no feeling in it. Why did she even play? That performance was the worst, and everything went wrong from then on. After finishing yet another insignificant performance, she was devastated. She couldn't live forever either. As she walked down the hallway, lost in her thoughts, a woman named Tabata caught up with her and thanked her for today's performance. She felt sorry that every time she could only give her such a trifle. She smiled and told her that everything was fine, that she was already grateful that there was a place where she could play the violin. Tabata said that thanks to her, everyone at the nursing home was much more cheerful. If she was so good, she should do it professionally. Masumi's face turned sad for a moment, and then she smiled and thanked the woman for her kind words. After saying goodbye to her, she left the nursing home and frowned, mentally replaying her words. She loved the violin. From the day her mother first gave her a violin, she became its captivity and practiced diligently every day. She had so much fun then, she just couldn't stop playing. And so while she was playing the violin, one girl constantly supported her and praised her. As a child, her friend was always by her side, listening to her playing and rejoicing with her. She loved her very much, thought that someday they would become professionals together. But her illness broke her. She came to the hospital to see her friend, and her friend told her the sad news. She only had 3 months to live. Masumi was scared. She said that this couldn't be. They had only made it as far as performing at a competition. Her friend said that she would still participate in it. This would be the last time she would be able to play with her. So tomorrow, let her play with all her might. Let her not hold back for her because she loves her acting so much and she wants to compete with her for real. And then that day came. The MC stood on stage and was very nervous. They had been playing side by side all this time, and if she was gone, what would happen to her? The judges were waiting for her performance to begin, and her friend, standing backstage, was very worried about her. Masumi pulled herself together and thought that she had to play, but that day she was never able to give it her all. And since then, she has never played for real. Her friend died, and she stopped striving for more. Now she plays only for a little money, and now, walking on the subway, she checked her mail. She received another letter about the interview result, another rejection. After university, she got a job, but soon quit, and now she is almost 30. And there is no permanent job. Society is a terrifying thing. Everything changes in the blink of an eye. She froze before going down into the subway and wondered what she was even living for. She heard a vendor nearby shouting that he was selling Christmas cakes, and she remembered that today was Christmas. Probably everyone celebrates this day with family or loved ones, and this year she was alone. No friends, no lover, no family. From that day on, everything inside her seemed to stop. What did her life even mean? She took a step, getting ready to go down into the subway, but suddenly lost her balance and fell down. Realizing this, she was terrified, grabbed the case with the violin and hugged it to her chest, closing her eyes, and then felt pain. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a dark forest, which confused her. She just fell on the stairs. Did she really die? If so, then this is the road to the Sanzu River. Her wallet and phone were gone, and her bag was gone. Only the case with the violin. She immediately checked the violin. It was intact. But why was only this here? While she was thinking about this, some man approached her and called out to her several times, but she didn't hear him. Then he grabbed her by the shoulder and asked excitedly, "She's back up, right?" She didn't understand what he was talking about, and he said that if she was here, it meant she had skills, but her vigilance was 0. Why was she hanging around here? Because of her, the patrol noticed them. Confused, she asked what he was even talking about, and he, looking into the case, asked if she could play. He was seeing this thing for the first time, but it is a musical instrument, right? She confusedly confirmed this, and he exclaimed that it was just great. Let her play anything she wanted. He spent all his strength, trying to lose his pursuers. She was worried by his assertiveness, and then a noise came from the bushes and she turned around, asking if there was someone there. The man swore, saying that they finally caught up with him. And then he started running, and MC called out to him, asking where he went. Let him at least tell her where she was. But he ignored her, and she, looking after him, thought, what the hell was that? For a few seconds everything was quiet. Then she heard a rustle behind her, and slowly turned around. A knight named Casimirias was standing next to her. She was scared by his sudden appearance, and, noticing the color of his hair and eyes, thought he was a foreigner. The man measured her with his gaze and said that her face was unfamiliar. What is she doing here? She was surprised that she somehow managed to understand his words, and said that she just wanted to ask about that. He did not let her speak and asked if she was a Latian spy. She exclaimed that this was not the case, and he asked, then, what was the box in her hands? She hugged the case to herself, afraid that he would take it from her, and when she did not answer his question, he took out a rope and said that he would find out everything himself, let her behave herself, and it would not hurt. After a while, they arrived at the estate, where a certain man named Ark was now sorting through documents in his office. Casimirias led the girl into his office and said that they had caught a spy, after which he roughly threw her to the floor, and she noted with displeasure that he had said that it would not hurt. She looked up at the man, and he remarked that it was very bold to sneak right into the center of the garrison. He carefully examined her and asked, so it was she who had infiltrated the territory of his order? Masumi was confused. She glanced at the man who had grabbed her, wondering if he meant a knightly order. Did such a thing exist in the afterlife? Casimirias approached Ark, telling him she had a strange box, and he asked if it was some kind of weapon. MC exclaimed that it wasn't. Don't they know what a violin is? Let them untie her immediately. Ark asked what kind of violin that was, and the knight said it was fine. If they use the essence revealing circle, they'll immediately know who she is. He extended his hand toward her, and immediately afterward she saw the glow of a magic circle forming beneath her feet. She was surprised that the floor was glowing, and Casimirias, perplexed, said that information usually appears above the object, but now there was nothing. Ark grinned and remarked that this was quite interesting. It looked like she had very strong protection. He told the knight he could go. He would handle the rest himself. Casimirias didn't want to leave him, but he couldn't disobey an order. When the knight left, Ark walked around Masumi and sat down on the chair opposite her, saying that going around the essence disclosure circle was impressive. She looked like a simpleton, but was actually an elite spy? She told him she wasn't a spy, and he asked, then how did she get here? There should have been guards right there. She told him she didn't know that. When she woke up, she was already here. He noted that this was too blatant a lie. What is she hiding? Did she know his name? She asked in displeasure. Why should she know that? He said his name, Arkristov Kanova, and her eyes widened in surprise. She tried to pronounce his name, but couldn't pronounce it. And he said that if it were an illusion, it would dissipate at the sound of his name. MC didn't understand what was going on at all. Suddenly she was accused of spying, dragged away somewhere by force, and the clothes these people were wearing were strange, and there was this glowing floor. It seemed she had ended up not in the afterlife, but in another world. Ark said that it looked like he would have to find out directly. He grabbed her arms and pushed her onto her back. Then with a smirk, told her to sit still for a bit. She imagined what he could do to her, and became very scared. Started kicking her legs, and begging him to let her go. And in an attempt to escape, she cut his cheek with her nail. He grabbed her hand and said that if she wanted to resist, she should do it seriously. Anyone who wanted to escape would even use their teeth. She was confused and thought that if she did this, everything would only get worse, and then turned her gaze to her violin. He noticed this and turned to the case, asking, so this is a weapon after all? He opened it and saw a musical instrument inside. At first, he thought it was a villard, but the shape was slightly different. Masumi grabbed his clothes and begged him to stop and to handle it more carefully. He asked if it was that important. She answered that he could see that it wasn't a weapon and that she wasn't some suspicious person. He said there was a chance that she was a spy posing as a musician. He took a violin out of the case and handed it to her, telling her to play. If she wasn't a spy, then let her prove it. She stared at the violin, but didn't dare take it and shook her head, refusing. Ark said he didn't understand her. She was suspected of spying. She was in a situation where her life was on the line. And yet she was refusing the only way to clear herself of suspicion? Why? She pursed her lips and thought that he was so easily telling her to play, but he didn't understand how dear the violin was to her. How much more valuable it was than her life. Since that day, she had never been able to truly play. She still hadn't found the answer to why she played the violin. She wouldn't play her precious violin for such a cruel man. She looked up at him and said she wouldn't play, and he thought, what was wrong with this woman? She was somehow different from all the spies who came before her. She had infiltrated the very heart of the knightly order, but she didn't look like a powerful mage or a skilled warrior. He asked her name, and when she said it, he remarked that it sounded rather strange. After that, he grabbed her hands and said that since she was so stubborn and didn't want to play the violin, he had another idea. She was scared and thought, what should she do? Now she definitely couldn't escape. At that moment, a knight burst into the office and excitedly called out to Ark, saying that something bad had happened and that he needed to go after him immediately. Ark let her go and told her to sit quietly and not to even think about escaping. It was useless. And casting one last glance at her, he left the office with the knight. After that, he asked, what was so urgent? There was nothing more urgent right now than dealing with the spy. Casimirias answered him that the musician had escaped. Ark was very surprised by this news. Musicians are people who make a living by playing instruments. It is customary for knightly orders to have their own musicians to perform music at ceremonies and rituals. Casimirias said that, according to those in charge of preparation, the musician had disappeared, along with his belongings, so he had most likely fled. Ark exclaimed that the initiation ceremony was tomorrow. If he didn't attend, it would damage the prestige of their order. The initiation ceremony is a mandatory ritual for becoming a knight. At the ceremony, an oath of allegiance to the empire is sworn, and the musician blesses it with his playing. Many townspeople come specifically to hear this music. Ark touched his chin in confusion and asked if he was still nearby. Casimirias replied that they had searched the entire area, but had found no trace of him. He noted that he was supposed to be guarding him, to which Casimirias replied that he had taken advantage of the moment when the commotion began during the night. He wondered why he had abandoned his post, but quickly remembered the woman and fell silent. Casimirias asked, did he remember? He had detected a magic caster's infiltration and had to leave. Ark awkwardly coughed into his fist and noted that this was a much more serious problem than some spy. Would it be possible to find a replacement in the city? He answered that, although it was a fairly large city, they would not find a musician of a suitable level. They offered high pay, but as soon as they mentioned his name, everyone immediately refused. Please, please, don't take this as rudeness. Ark sighed heavily and asked, is it because of him? Is he that bad? The knight answered him that it wasn't that he was bad, but sometimes he went beyond the pale. Ark thought about it. He needed to somehow solve this problem, and he remembered that the woman apparently had a villard. MC meanwhile looked at her wrists, which until recently were tied. She thought that she died and went to the afterlife. Instead, she found herself embroiled in some strange story, but at least her wrist didn't hurt now. She opened the door a crack, looked through the crack, and seeing the knight, thought that it looked like she wouldn't be able to escape anyway. She turned to the violin, picked it up, and carefully checked each side for scratches and chips, and making sure that it was intact, she breathed a sigh of relief. She received this violin when her mentor died in high school. He left this to her. Since that day, she played only this violin, and now she simply can't imagine playing another. If she can be close to this, then she doesn't care where she is. She wants this beautiful melody to continue to make her heart grow fonder. That's all. Suddenly, the door to the office swung open loudly, and she shuddered in fright. Ark asked, didn't she say she was a musician? She indignantly exclaimed that she hadn't said that. He had made it up himself, and she was just an amateur. He approached her and asked, but this villard is hers, right? She answered him that it was a violin, and it really did belong to her. He didn't let her finish, and said that then the conversation was over. If the instrument was hers, then she knew how to play it. She hesitantly confirmed this, and he said that everything was decided. She would perform as a musician at the knighting ceremony. She stared into his determined eyes in surprise, thoughtfully ran her fingers over the strings, and said that she didn't want to. He became angry and asked if she even understood the situation she was in. She would be accused of espionage, and her fate depended on his decision. If he ordered it, she could be executed. She exclaimed, didn't she already say that she wouldn't play the violin? Besides, she was already dead, so no execution frightened her. He frowned and sat down next to her, asking, did she just say that she was dead? What did she mean? She told him that she meant exactly what she said, that this was the afterlife. She fell on the steps of the subway and woke up here. And then that blonde guy grabbed her. Ark asked if she even understood where she was. She hesitantly answered that she was in the afterlife, and then she began to guess that this was not true at all. He told her that this was the Alberic Empire, a completely real, existing state in the very north of the central continent. She thoughtfully lowered her gaze and asked excitedly, so this is really another world? She immediately got up and rushed to the window, and seeing mountains and a huge city in the middle of them, she was very surprised. It was hard for her to accept this. She backed away from the window, on trembling legs, and Ark caught her, saying that he thought that something was wrong here. She immediately turned to him, and he said that she appeared out of nowhere, and the conversation was not going well at all. Besides, the Essence Disclosure Circle had no effect on her. Of course, he still can't rule out the possibility that she is a spy, and he will check everything later. But one thing is certain, this is not the afterlife, and she is not dead. No matter how much she tries to be brave, her life is in his hands. Her name is Masumi, right? And he will repeat to her, tomorrow at the knighting ceremony she will perform as a musician. She was clearly not happy with this prospect, but there was nothing else to do. A new day began, and since early morning she did nothing but look out the window and try to comprehend that this really was another world. Casimirias came into her room and said it was time to go to the ceremony, which made her frown. She was asked, or rather forced, to perform at the knighting ceremony in place of the escaped musician. Due to their hopeless situation, she agreed. They left the building and rode horseback to the ceremony site. Casimirias told her it was an extremely important rite. Young men gathered before the commander-in-chief of the Knight Corps, and in exchange for swearing allegiance to the Empire, they are given a sword and shield. Then they are given the magical power necessary for battle, and they swear to live as knights. She asked, but is the musician's role in such a ritual really that important? She found it hard to imagine. He answered that when the commander-in-chief transfers the magical power, a blessing in the form of musical accompaniment is necessary. She asked with obvious skepticism, a blessing then? They had already hired one musician, right? If he ran away, perhaps he wasn't paid enough? Casimirias told her they had paid the entire amount in advance and in full, and she asked if something had happened to his family. He told her that to avoid this, they chose a single musician without relatives, and then she asked discontentedly, Maybe it was because the working conditions were simply hellish. He remained silent, not knowing what to say to this, and she indignantly exclaimed, "Why did he remain silent? Let him tell her that she is wrong. Did she really need to play 24 hours straight without a break?" He answered her that she needed to play for a maximum of 30 minutes. And she asked, then why was he silent? He preferred not to answer this question, citing the fact that they had to hurry. Very soon, they were already at the place where the ceremony was taking place, the Colosseum. She admired the architecture of this building, and saw the townspeople hurrying there to take the best seats, among whom was a joyful girl with her mother. The knights were in anticipation of such a solemn event, and MC thought that everyone was so inspired. So many people are waiting for this ceremony, but will she cope? No matter how hard she tries to play, the sound is still not the same as it was before the competition, and now she needs to go on stage. Kasumireya said they had arrived, pointed to the tent, and said Sir Ark was already there, preparing for the ceremony. He led her there and informed the commander-in-chief that he had brought Lady Masumi. The preparations for the ritual were mostly complete. All that remained was to prepare for the musician's performance. Ark's voice came from behind the screen, telling him he had done a good job. And then Kasumireya turned to Masumi and asked if she could tell him what she needed for the performance, and how much time it would take to tune the instrument. There was little time before the start, but they would try to accommodate her wishes. She smiled ironically, and mentally noted the difference in relationships between when she was a spy and now. So it really was an important profession in this world. She told him that everything was fine. She didn't need to play in an ensemble with anyone, did she? He asked if she was absolutely sure she didn't need anything. She confirmed this, and said that she only needed to know where exactly to stand and when to start, and also when to finish. He nodded, showing that he understood everything, and Ark, having finished changing, came out from behind the screen and said that they would tell her everything, and she just needed to play. The beginning would be the moment when the blue color began to shimmer. When the last knight received his share of the light, she could finish as she saw fit. She stared at him in surprise, examining him from head to toe, and then let out an ecstatic sigh and said that a beautiful outfit would make even the devil handsome. He asked what that was supposed to mean. She told him that the outfit suited him very well, although it looked too flashy to wear all the time. "Is this a ceremonial suit?" He confirmed this and said that it was an incomplete dress uniform, but he still felt stuffy. She asked how the dress uniform was different, and he told her that the dress uniform had more decorations and was significantly heavier. After that, she fell silent and stared at him, and after a short pause, said that she wanted to see what he would look like in what he hated so much. He frowned and asked if she was kidding. She had asked him to wear it. It cost him nothing, and he indignantly said that he didn't want to. Why should he do this for her? Kasumireya, tired of listening to all this, intervened in their argument, saying that the guard soldiers' uniforms were even heavier and hotter. They both turned their gazes on him and his heavy armor. Ark felt awkward and he changed the subject, saying that, be that as it may, it was good that the ceremony would still take place. Kasumireya said that was certainly true, but it was too early to rejoice. By a stroke of luck, they managed to find a musician, but this girl is suspected of being a spy. Besides, they know nothing about her except that she carries a musical instrument. Entrusting such an important role to such a person is risky. It's possible the ceremony will end in failure. And besides, this doesn't solve the root of the problems facing their knight corps. Ark wanted to say something, but a knight entered the tent and informed him that the time had come. They needed to go to the altar. They went to the Colosseum. MC followed Kasumireya, and the knights lined up along the path they had to take. Before moving on, he turned to her and extended his hand. She looked at him confidently and took his hand, after which she thought that she wasn't the one needed in this place. She understood perfectly well that they needed her not as a person, but as a person who knew how to play an instrument. She was chosen only because she was there at the right moment, and she is very nervous. She may not be able to play with the same dedication as before, but she will try. She walked up to the center stage, after which Sir Ark came out and waved to everyone present with a smile. Masumi looked around. She noticed the girl she saw recently in the spectator seats, and thought that if she could do something for all those who were waiting for this day, then going out on this stage was the right choice. Ark approached the knights and raised his sword, saying that may blessings descend upon those preparing to become knights. May they follow the strength of righteousness, be brave, honest, magnanimous knights with steadfast convictions. May they protect the country, protect the weak, and defend the truth. May they turn the power that they grant them against evil thoughts, dispel bad intentions, and crush evil. May they become protectors of all. Seeing the glow, MC immediately began playing the violin. She decided to perform a composition by Edward Elgar, Pomp and Ceremonial Marches. Hearing the melody, Kasumireya turned his surprised gaze to her, and she thought it was a march written for military parades, bright, solemn, and majestic. She knew nothing about their world or their customs, but for the day that people were waiting for with such impatience, for the day when a knight's heart is filled with pride, this melody would be perfect. When the glow ended, she finished playing the composition. She lowered her head and caught her breath, waiting for the audience's reaction, and when they all shouted with delight, she looked up at them in surprise. She saw how the girl herself was applauding her with delight, saw how Ark looked at her with a smile, and was glad that she had finally managed to do it. The main event of the day, the initiation ceremony, concluded successfully. They marched through the city streets, filled with a cheering crowd. Everyone was overjoyed, but she still couldn't play at full strength. The moment she finished her performance and lowered her bow, she realized that the injury that prevented her from playing wouldn't disappear so easily. And yet, people rejoiced, admired, and applauded her performance. This fact shocked her more than anything, and she involuntarily began to hope that someday she would find the key to lifting this curse. After the march ended, Ark told her that she would go watch the Knights tournament with Casamirias next. She immediately declined, tournament or whatever, but she had been on her feet all day and was terribly tired. Ark asked if she had misunderstood anything. He approached her menacingly and roughly poked his finger into her shoulder, reminding her that she had not yet been completely cleared of suspicion of espionage. So far they can't establish either her origin or her identity for sure, except that she knows how to play an instrument. He can't leave her alone. However, right now he has a dinner scheduled with the mayor, and he can't take her with him. Did she understand everything? She remained silent and nervously clutched the hem of her skirt, after which he said with a smile that it was a traditional competition of their country, and that she should try to enjoy it at least a little. She had no choice. She had to go there. The people who came to the ceremony were sweating in the sun. Fortunately, she and Sir Casamirias were sitting under an awning. She thought that the sun wasn't blinding them too much, but there were a lot of people, and it was stuffy outside. She glanced at Casamirias, who was sitting with a stony expression, and thought that she felt so uncomfortable around him. The first impression was terrible. He always acts distant. It was completely unclear what he was thinking, and how was she supposed to communicate with him at all? Suddenly her stomach growled loudly. Casamirias looked at her and asked, "Is she hungry?" Her face flushed with shame, and she indignantly said that of course she was hungry. She hadn't eaten anything since they captured her. He noted that she was right. He was sorry that they hadn't shown due care. He would give the order to bring her something edible from the nearby shops. He called the knight to him and told him to hurry if possible. Let them write this bill down in the garrison. He could tell him his name. The knight glanced at the musician, who was fanning herself from the heat, and left. After a while, he returned with a bag of food. He approached her and apologized for keeping her waiting. She asked where the commander of the knights had gone, and he clarified. She's talking about Casamirias? He seemed to be called by someone important, and he walked away. He handed her the bag, saying he hoped she would like it, and she thanked him with a smile. There was a sandwich inside, smelling deliciously of fried meat, so she started eating right away. She took the first bite, but the knight was still standing next to her, and she asked if he had some business with her. He smiled awkwardly and apologized for his impudence, but he had a question for her. She frowned and told him to speak, and he, not knowing where to begin, awkwardly asked if her contract with the commander-in-chief was limited to just this one time. She didn't understand what he was talking about. Did he mean a contract to perform as a musician? What kind of contract was that? The musician had run away, there was an emergency, and she had rather just helped them. But did she have the right to answer this herself? She coughed awkwardly into her fist, unsure of what to say, and he stated that if her contract with the commander-in-chief was only valid for the duration of the ceremony, he would like to get closer to her before the other knights. She immediately turned a surprised look to him, and he said that if she was not already in anyone's service, he would very much like to ask her about it. He knelt before her and asked if she would agree to be his personal musician. She felt very awkward and confused, and at that very moment, Casamirias approached. He put his hand on the knight's shoulder and threateningly told him that he had clearly stated that individual negotiations with the musician were prohibited. He was frightened by his sudden appearance and began to look for excuses, and he asked why he dared to disobey his order. Masumi stood up for him and exclaimed that it was not like that at all. He simply brought her food and they talked a little. There was nothing worth being angry about. Casamirias closed his eyes, calming down, then slapped the knight on the back and ordered him to return to his place. He left, and he took his place next to Masumi, and she thought it was so awkward. After all, she didn't like this man at all. The nightly competition was in full swing. They were running on horses with spears, and MC was already quite tired of watching all this. She yawned and covered her mouth with her hand. Casamirias noticed this and said that he understood that she was bored watching the same fights, but she should be patient. She immediately apologized to him, saying that she didn't mean to show it, and he told her that everything was fine. In such competitions, unlike real combat, thrusts are more often used, where it is easier to demonstrate differences in strength. To those who do not understand, this might seem boring. Now she understood why everyone attacked the same way, and he, pointing to a canopy in the middle of the spectator seats, said that this tournament had another purpose. Stately men were sitting under the canopy. They were nobles and merchants from west of, looking for suitors or adopted sons here. She did not quite understand what he meant, and he explained to her that the tournament lasts 7 days, and on the first day there is a tournament among new recruits. The nobles want to find talented young knights and adopt them into their family. She asked in confusion, "What kind of market is this? Are knights even happy with this?" He answered that some, on the contrary, desire it. For those born commoners, this is a chance to become nobles. She leaned her head in her hand, bored, and thought that aristocratic society was not entirely clear to her. She asked, "What about him?" He was the captain of the guard, so he had enough strength, and he seemed popular in this city. He had probably been offered similar marriage deals more than once. He answered that he couldn't say there hadn't been any offers, but, honestly, he would have wanted a personal musician more than just marrying into the nobility. She asked, "What does a personal musician even mean? Why is everyone so fixated on it? What value is there in it? What is the connection between a musician playing an instrument and a knight defending the country?" Casimirias remembered how she played, clenched his fist, and was about to say something, but suddenly an alarm sounded. Everyone present became agitated. Casimirias immediately shouted that all duels scheduled for today were cancelled from now on. An alarm had been sounded. The Fourth Knightly Order would immediately move to suppress the magical beasts. People began to emerge from the Colosseum, anxiously asking what had happened. They were frightened, but they knew the knights would definitely protect them. Casimirias gathered the knights and ordered them to check if they had enough equipment. He was told that the number seemed sufficient, but if the fight dragged on, it would be difficult. The commander said that those who didn't have horses should take tournament horses, one each. What kind and how many magical beasts were there? While they were discussing this, Masumi stood to the side. She didn't really understand, but this was an emergency. She had to try not to disturb anyone. Casimirias approached her with his horse and grabbed her hand, telling her she would be coming with them. She was confused, and he told her that he had orders from the Lord Commander. Continue surveillance until the suspicion of espionage was completely removed. She was speechless with shock, but there was nothing to be done, and so she now rode with him to meet the monsters, which turned out to be wolves. Seeing the entire pack, Casimirias ordered everyone to hold their position until Lord Ark arrived. The first, second, and third squads of spearmen were to form the vanguard. They obeyed his order and prepared to meet the wolves. Then, Casimirias swung his sword and ordered the attack. They were facing about 300 wolves. Their numbers had to be reduced as much as possible. The knights rushed into battle, the wolves biting into their arms and legs, throwing them off their horses and finishing them off. Casimirias killed one of them with a sword and ran on his horse. MC looked around nervously, thinking that one after another was falling. It seemed like the defensive line was crumbling. If this continued, it would be dangerous. She asked why they always only defended themselves and didn't attack. Couldn't they use some strong spell? He responded that if they could, they would have already done so. She looked up at him and met his stern gaze, and he said that this is what it means to not have a personal musician. She didn't understand what he was talking about, and at that moment, a wolf pounced on them. Seeing this, she closed her eyes in fear and thought that they were finished. In order to protect her, Casimirias extended his hand towards the wolf, and then there was an explosion. The horse and the two of them were thrown aside. Masumi quickly checked herself and said with relief that they seemed to be alive. Seeing Casimirias lying next to her and breathing heavily, she called out to him worriedly and asked what was wrong. He told her that his magic was exhausted and there were no wounds, so she shouldn't worry. She was confused and thought that he used magic to save her, which meant it was because of her that he was having a hard time. He couldn't fight, but he also couldn't leave her alone, so he carried her around with him, and now he could soon die. Once again, because of her, a man is dying. When she was 14, her mother died, a kind, always smiling woman. She always supported her violin studies. In her grief after her death, her violin teacher, whom her mother introduced her to, supported her. He was a strict but very caring teacher. But that same year, already at an advanced age, he died of complications from pneumonia. She thought about giving up many times, but she was held back by the violin he left her and the letter, as well as her best friend Cynthia, who, like her, dreamed of becoming a violinist, and they were supposed to make their dream come true. She pursed her lips and hung over Casimirias' face, asking if there was anything she could do. She couldn't fight like everyone else, but if there was something that only she, as a musician, could do, let him teach her. He reached out to her face and asked her to play a melody, so the magical energy would be restored. That's what a musician was for. Now she understood why everyone wanted a personal musician so much, and, confidently clenching her fist, told him to be patient a little longer. They needed to go somewhere. She helped him up, and he asked where they needed to go. She told him that to play, you need an instrument. She saw a man with a case similar to a violin case. Meanwhile, a woman with a case named Anshira was walking within the city walls. All the townspeople heard a strange sound approaching them from outside, which made them nervous. The woman worriedly hugged the case, and then suddenly felt a touch on her hand, and Masumi happily said that she found it. She looked at her in confusion and asked if she was the musician from the initiation ceremony. MC apologized for the suddenness. Is she holding a musical instrument? She laid the knight on the floor and asked her to let her look at it, and opening the case, she saw a Villard. It looked like a violin, but still different. The size, shape, and the presence of a bow reminded her of a violin, but she couldn't figure out what range of sound it had. She asked the woman if she was wearing this, so she was a musician. She answered that she only kept it and didn't know how to play. Masumi said that she understood that this was a sudden request, and she felt very awkward. Can she lend her this instrument? Just for the time it takes to restore its magical energy. If this continues, the magical beasts will break through and kill everyone. She doesn't want to watch helplessly as everyone dies anymore. And Shiro was slightly confused. She glanced at Villard and said she could take it. She excitedly thanked her, then tuned the instrument and played a few notes experimentally, then told Casimiras with a smile that she was starting. If she plays a little worse than at the ceremony, he shouldn't be angry with her. She decided to perform Vittorio Monti's Chardas. After her mother died, and then her mentor and best friend passed away, leaving her alone, she, although she understood that it was not her fault, continued to blame herself, helpless and pathetic, unable to do anything for them. And she felt ashamed in front of them, because they worried about her until the end. Maybe she can't forgive herself yet, but she wants to at least do what she can with all her might. Casimiras finally woke up, and she ran up to him and asked if he was feeling better. He smiled and told her that his magical energy had been restored. He never thought such a day would come. He knelt before her and bowed his head, asking her to accept his gratitude. Her performance was beautiful. She only smiled at him in response, and then there was a crash and someone's scream. The knight shielded the girl with his body, and seeing the wolf within the city walls, exclaimed, "Has the barrier really been breached?" MC was frightened, unsure of what to do, but Ark arrived just in time, saying they'd been tinkering with this for a long time. There was an explosion. He easily destroyed the wolf and thanked them for their help. They could leave the rest to him. They left the city. Casimiras called out to the commander-in-chief, who remarked that since he was in such a battered state, it meant they had worked hard here. What was the state of the magical beasts and their forces? He replied that they had killed about half, but the soldiers were greatly depleted. He feared only about a third could still fight normally. Ark said that was enough, then turned to the knights and ordered them to take the wounded to the rear, ensure the safety of the townspeople, and report immediately if anything happened. Those who can still move and have magic left should regroup into squads and follow him. The knight's morale immediately rose, and Masumi mentally noted that it was incredible. His mere appearance was enough to completely change the atmosphere. He suddenly called out to her, causing her to flinch, and ordered her to stay behind with Casimiras. He would finish quickly, and he was also grateful to her for playing for Casimiras. Thus, the magical beasts that attacked during the knight's tournament were completely destroyed, and they returned to the estate. The maid asked Masumi if she was satisfied with the dinner. She answered that it was very delicious, and she said that if she had any other requests, she should always ask her. MC thought that this is what it means to be a musician. The attitude is completely different. The maid showed her to her room and, wishing her a pleasant rest, told her that if she needed anything, she should call her. She left, and Masumi entered the room, her face immediately twisted in disgust. Ark was inside. He lay down on the sofa and asked what kind of expression she had on her face. She asked displeasedly why he was here, to which he answered that this was actually his room, so it was nothing surprising. She thinks he likes sharing a room with her? He can't leave a spy unattended. She sighed heavily and muttered that he was at it again, and he, pointing to the sofa opposite him, told her not to stand there, but to sit down. She nervously clutched the hem of her skirt, sat down opposite him with a proud look, and he said that he never had time to return it to her. He put the case with her violin on the table, and she asked if he kept it for himself. He answered her that it was so, or rather, the garrison commandant personally brought it to him. She asked if he was an important person. Perhaps. He said that he was below him, so she shouldn't think about it. She noticed that he had strange criteria, and he said that it was the Villard of his personal musician. If even a scratch appeared on it, his head would be cut off. She frowned and thought that he was saying strange things again, then looked at him carefully. He was lying on the sofa, frowning and touching his head, as if something was bothering him. She asked if he was hurt somewhere or tired. He asked, perplexed, why she was suddenly interested in this, and she noticed that he was somehow lethargic, or rather, he looked terribly tired. Is he okay? It had been hard today. Maybe it would be better for him to go to bed? He closed his eyes and asked her to play something. Their knightly merits, if she acknowledged them, could she play one melody? She asked in confusion. What other merits? His words made no sense. He was silent for a few seconds, then looked away and smiled bitterly, saying that she was right. He got up from the couch and told her to forget about it. He must be tired, so he would go to bed. In the next room they had also made a bed for her. She looked after him with irritation and called out to him, saying that she could at least listen. Today she realized that they were from completely different worlds, where there were monsters and magic, which she knew nothing about. But even if she knew nothing, she could at least listen to someone who was having a hard time. He constantly intimidated her, saying that she was a spy, But when the monsters appeared, he fought with all his might for the sake of the knights and townspeople. If that is the kind of person he is, then she could at least listen to him a little. At first, he was surprised by her words, and then with a smirk noted that she was so arrogant. Ark said that since she asked, he'd tell her a little about them. Masumi was surprised that he decided to do so, so he settled back and explained that in this country, there was a knightly order specializing in defensive magic, and an order of mages specializing in offensive magic. Ideally, the knightly order would protect the mages like a shield, and magic like a spear would destroy the enemy. But their fourth order, the knightly order, was no longer capable of acting as a shield. Masumi was surprised. How could it be incapable? Ark replied yes, to function as a shield, a supply line of magical energy was needed, but their guild lacked such a supply line, and no musician. They'd appealed to the crown many times, but the musicians were always sent to the mages first, and they simply didn't reach them. The knightly order had no magic regeneration, so they were simply expendable. When he explained all this, he bowed his head in sadness, and Masumi looked at him in surprise. She was stunned when she heard these words. They're prepared for their ultimate demise whenever it comes, but they're also people, and don't want to die in vain. Telling her this probably makes no sense, but still. At that moment, Masumi began playing a melody that had a pleasant effect on both her and Ark. He asked, "Is that her playing?" Masumi replied that if she heard music she was playing. She continued playing the melody, and Ark looked into her eyes, telling her she was good at it. Masumi replied that he shouldn't judge her by her, since she'd been playing since she was 3. He asked, "But why continue doing it for so many years if she's not even a musician?" Masumi replied with a smile that it was because she enjoyed it. She was so happy to see her skill grow. No matter how much time she spent, it was never enough. She even thought she wished she could play forever. Ark was surprised by these words and asked, "Did she enjoy it?" She confirmed, yes, and Ark said he did too, because he loves this country. He became a knight, this country where he was born. These are the people he wants to protect. She moved even closer to his face and thought, she didn't know why, at that moment, she simply really wanted to be near him. She wiped the tears from his face and thanked him for telling her about it. They continued to stand next to each other for a while, after which Ark asked, "Do you want a change of clothes?" Masumi confidently answered, yes, she'd been wearing the same one for several days. It was already at its limit. She didn't need different or special dresses. She just wanted regular, everyday clothes. Ark thought for a moment and replied that he understood everything, and a moment later she dressed up. She went into a special section where there were many clothes, and a girl approached her and asked, "Miss Musician, how do you like this outfit?" She added, "The color is bright, and the design is in fashion now. It's a very popular model." Masumi exclaimed and replied that it was very beautiful, after which she thanked Miss Anshira for helping her choose. She truly helped her out. When choosing women's clothing, it's better to listen to a woman's opinion. Ark said so, because Anshira is the daughter of the Duke of Marino. Everyone is placed in the knightly order, and she agreed to go with her. By the way, that mansion doesn't belong to the knightly order, does it? Ark is just so confident in using it that she assumed it belonged to them. Anshira replied that their family annually provides this mansion for the initiation ceremony, and the musicians also often stayed there. Masumi asked again, did that mean she had met the previous musicians? She replied that she had. Masumi didn't understand this reaction. Why had she suddenly hesitated? Perhaps she shouldn't have called her so suddenly, and now she feels uncomfortable. She feels like she's bothering her somehow, and besides, she feels like she's met Miss Anshira somewhere before. Suddenly, Ark approached them and asked, "How long will it take?" Masumi was irritated by his stubbornness, and said he didn't have to follow her. He replied that he wasn't there by choice either. How many times should he repeat it to her? She was still under suspicion of espionage, so he couldn't leave her alone. But if it was so burdensome to him, he could have entrusted it to Casimirius. Ark replied that he was in charge of the knight's tournament today and didn't have time to bother with her. If she understood, then she should finish quickly. Masumi replied, okay. When he cried, he was quieter and even a little sweeter. They both tried not to remember yesterday, and if they started paying attention to it, it would only become awkward. She lifted several dresses to the cash register and asked to pay, please. When the saleswoman looked at the documents, she asked for a signature. Masumi was surprised and asked, "Is that all?" Anshira smiled and replied that this was confirmation of the shopping list. Later, this would send the 4th knightly order to the imperial capital, and Masumi thought it would be quite convenient. Then they left the store, and Anshira suggested that Miss Musician have a snack before going to the next store as it was lunchtime. Masumi agreed that this was a great idea and asked Ark if they could do that. Ark replied that he didn't care, and the girls were delighted and decided to go to lunch. When Masumi entered the cafe, they were brought a dish, and after tasting it, she realized how delicious it was. At that moment, Anshira asked, "Miss Musician, Mr. Commander-in-Chief, are they really comfortable sitting outside? It's much quieter inside." Masumi replied that everything was fine, the weather was nice, and it was even easier to breathe here. Later, Masumi said that thanks to her, Miss Anshira, she quickly found everything she needed, and even brought her to such a delicious place. A big thank you to her. And Shira replied that she shouldn't have given such a compliment. Frankly, they believed she was the one who saved them yesterday. Yesterday, when the monster attacked, she played, and thanks to that, they were safe. Masumi was surprised and realized what had happened. So it was she who gave her that instrument back then? And Shira replied, yes, it was she. She had just been on her way to pick up her sister's villar from repairs and happened to have it there. Today, she wanted to thank her and was worried whether someone like her could even be useful. Masumi told her not to say that, when suddenly Anshira's voice changed and said that she was of no use to either the family or the country, that she was simply a burden. Masumi hadn't expected to hear that at all and asked, what do you mean? Anshira suddenly exclaimed that she was apologizing because she hadn't wanted to talk about it. The thing is, her sister works outside the home, and she can't be of any use on her own, even though she hosts musicians every year, but they always dislike something and often scold her for it, and she was so nervous around her because she was afraid of angering her like the other musicians. She said, yesterday she was so cool. Maybe she was good for nothing anyway. She did nothing but despond. She no longer wanted to watch helplessly as everyone died, and yet when she saw how Masumi bravely went towards danger, she was very surprised. Masumi replied that this was not true at all, and Anshira was surprised. Masumi said that she was only able to play because she lent her an instrument. If she hadn't given it, everything would have definitely ended terribly, so she should thank her, and today she had done so much for her. So, she is not a useless burden at all. Anshira blushed with embarrassment and said in a trembling voice, Madam Musician, thank her. After that, she lowered her gaze, and suddenly a maid came running to them and informed the mistress that the master of the house was calling her. The people said that guests had arrived at the mansion, and she was asked to return immediately. Anshira replied that they weren't finished shopping yet, and Masumi, smiling, said it was okay. They'd almost bought everything, and she could handle the rest without her. Anshira apologized to her and the commander-in-chief. She'd have to leave. They'd deliver the rewards she'd bought. The guys thanked her and said they'd see each other at the mansion. After that, Masumi waved to Anshira, and she left. When Masumi turned to look at Ark, he was sitting in a relaxed pose and glaring at her. Masumi asked again, what? Ark replied that at first he thought she was a rather cold girl, but she turned out to be surprisingly pleased. Masumi was surprised, and he said that yesterday, and now, he had a merino at home with his daughter, and she pokes her nose into everything. Masumi replied that she didn't think it was anything special, since she'd simply listened to her. Ark replied that that was exactly what he was talking about. Masumi was displeased and said that she wasn't so kind and gentle after all. She simply couldn't ignore her, because she seemed to see herself in that girl, who had fallen out of society and lost her purpose in life. At that moment, their gazes met, and suddenly someone cried out, everyone needs to run. A magic beast appeared here. Ark jumped up from his chair, and Masumi was stunned by what she saw. People started asking, what, where? Had any of them really survived yesterday? It was simply impossible. After all, he had personally destroyed it. How had it managed to get through the city's protective barrier? Ark decided he'd figure it out and be back soon, and that she shouldn't go anywhere. Masumi told him to wait, and after watching him leave, she couldn't say anything for a moment before suddenly falling. A guy approached her, apologizing and asking if she was hurt. Would she be able to get up? He offered her his hand, and Masumi smiled and replied, I think so. She said, I think so. He said it was his fault, but wasn't she by any chance the Supreme Commander's musician? Masumi was stunned and said, I think so. The guy replied that he'd been at the initiation ceremony yesterday, and her performance had been simply magnificent. Masumi thanked him for his words and thought it was easier for her to agree than to deny. She asked which knights she'd served with before. The Supreme Commander must have had a hard time, but with her, he would have received tremendous support. He admitted that it was true, but it was a shame they hadn't met earlier. Then the Fourth Knightly Order might have worked much more smoothly. If they had a musician, they could fight properly and wouldn't become the scum of the earth. Now the people can rest easy. He smiled and looked into her eyes, and at that moment, Masumi clenched her fist and began screaming for forgiveness. Yes, the Fourth Order might not have been able to fight at full strength before, but even in such difficult conditions, they did their duty with all their might. It's still wrong to talk about them like that. The unknown man was surprised by her reaction and said she was right. He was apologizing, but he had gone too far. But it was true that with her, they would have become 100 times stronger. Leaving such an important person alone, he was surprisingly well off. The guy got too close to Masumi, and she realized she'd seen that face somewhere before. He continued smiling and said that you can't let go of what's dear. He wrapped his arms around Masumi as she fell unconscious onto his shoulder. Sometime later, they found themselves in his house. Masumi was sleeping on the couch but suddenly woke up and looked at her hands. The boy approached the window and said that this task was too difficult for them, and that the banneret class would be more suitable. Masumi, confused as she was, looked around silently. Then she asked who he was. The boy came closer, and Masumi realized she was tied up. She mused that compared to Ark and Casimiria's, this man didn't look as strong, so he was most likely not a knight but the mage Ark had mentioned. But why kidnap her at all? And that voice was rather strange. Suddenly she realized, was he the man she met in the forest? Back when they ran into each other in the city, she'd still doubted it, but now she was sure of it, because the timbre of his voice was the same. Pitch, or range, can be adjusted if desired. With training, one can control one's voice within approximately 4 octaves, so even words will be intelligible. But it's impossible to change the timbre. That's the color of the voice. The guy chuckled at how well she remembered him, considering she'd been listening with half an ear at the time. Masumi asked what his goal was. He replied that she thought she knew who was most often targeted in the nightly orders. Ark was probably furiously searching for her now, and she realized she was just bait to lure him out. But it was a shame to disappoint him, since she wasn't his personal musician. When she mentioned this, the guy was stunned and asked, "What?" Masumi replied that she simply felt too lazy to explain everything then, so she didn't do it. She didn't become his personal musician because circumstances forced her to retreat. So as a hostage, she was completely worthless. If anything, she apparently accidentally entered the garrison illegally and was immediately suspected of espionage. Moreover, in the confusion, the real musician escaped, so she, who was there with her instrument, simply stood in as a substitute. The guy asked her to wait and asked, so she wasn't on garrison territory because she was a musician? She replied, just because it just happened. He didn't understand. The base had intrusion detection magic installed. How had she gotten around it? She hadn't figured it out herself and didn't even know how it happened. She didn't remember saying it, and anyway, she was just an ordinary person who didn't have any magic. The guy sat down in a chair and realized that this couldn't be true. That meant his kidnapping her made no sense. He clenched his teeth in anger and said, "Wow, it seems he'd made the wrong choice. His condolences." If she had turned out to be a real escaped musician, then according to this guy's plan, the city would have been in total panic. His plan wasn't yet clear, but he most likely wanted to take advantage of the chaos to plot against Ark, and instead of a key figure, he kidnapped a suspected spy. Strangely, she even sympathized with him a little. She probably still doesn't fully grasp the situation, which is why she's looking at it from the outside. The guy asked, "So she's just a woman who accidentally got caught up in all this?" He didn't fully believe her words, but it was surprising that she'd been helping a knightly order, and the Fourth Order in particular, for no apparent reason. Masumi replied that it was just a series of coincidences, a useless order and a failed musician. In a way, they were perfect for each other. She replied that back in the city, she thought, is he asking for trouble? She didn't think those were appropriate words for a first meeting. The guy replied, on the contrary, he was worried about her, because it seemed she didn't understand her situation at all. After a brief silence, he replied, well, even if he was the wrong person, since he kidnapped her, that's her destiny. He'd show her how pathetic those she called worthy really are. This Fourth Knightly Order was initially short-staffed and on the verge of disbanding, but now they have a large number of knights and have somewhat regained their functionality. This alone is perhaps impressive, especially considering the current commander-in-chief, Ark, possesses an exceptional amount of magical power and assumed his position at just 15 years old. He was the one who revived the Fourth Order. The commander-in-chief is obliged to share his magical power with those who initiate with such a spark. He traveled throughout the Alberic Empire, gathering candidates, and with his colossal magical power, he increased the number of knights from 10 to 200. Even his ability to attract Casimirias, the man with the highest magical power of any guard commander in history, is also to his credit. As a result, the Fourth Order possesses a high level of magical power and demonstrates astonishing efficiency. But behind this lies the grave sin they have committed. Masumi was surprised by these words, and he explained that the Fourth Knightly Order wears its musicians to the limit. Their strength is immeasurable compared to other orders, and naturally, the musicians are subject to a corresponding strain, especially since no musician can keep up with the young commander's frantic pace. Not a single musician lasted longer than 3 months, and as a result, he hasn't had a permanent personal musician since he was 18. If a commander doesn't have a musician, then he can't have a lower-ranking subordinate. In other words, although they somehow managed to return, they simultaneously became known as the order that wears out musicians. The very name Ark commands. No other order in history has ever had such a bad reputation. Masumi asked again, so what if it changes anything? The guy replied that he explained everything, but she still doesn't understand. A musician drawn into the Fourth Order faces a fate far more interesting than death. He said it was a one-time occurrence, but since they'd finally found a suitable musician, they would never let her go. She replied that she's grateful for the work, and he asked, does she really still not understand? He approached her and looked her in the eye with disdain, then said that, judging by the brilliant appearance he'd seen at the ceremony, Her disappearance would be a serious blow to them. Let her become their country's musician. They would even form a bloody alliance. Masumi was dumbfounded by this, and the man continued to say that if she promised not to return to the Fourth Knightly Order, they would accept her with all due honor. Masumi imagined herself as the chief musician and how wonderful her life would be, when suddenly she remembered the words of Casimirius, who thanked her for playing, and Arc, and at that moment her heart sank. She refused the offer, and the man asked, does she think he's joking? He's warning her after all, and she's deliberately choosing the path to her own destruction. Masumi replied that, frankly, after the way this group treated her, she doesn't believe his words about an honorable reception. She doesn't even know who he is or where he's from, so she's not going to blindly follow him on his word. Besides, it seems she's truly too compassionate and can't just abandon people who are struggling. This guy was in shock and completely confused about what was happening. There wasn't a single person who didn't know what it meant to contact the Fourth Knightly Order, not just in Alberic but also in his own country, and even after his explanation, she still wanted to lend them a helping hand. This didn't seem like the thinking of someone from outside this world. He was dumbfounded and said, by the way, she said she didn't know anything. Could she really be a summoned girl? At that moment, Arc burst into their room, and a moment later, a powerful explosion rocked the room. Sometime before this incident, Casimirius was walking down the long corridor at the estate and saw Lady Unshira and addressed her. She approached him, and he asked, is she alone? Hadn't she gone into the city with Arc and Lady Musician? And Shira replied that her father had summoned her, which is why she returned early. She thought they should be back soon. At that moment, Arc came closer, and Casimirius asked, has he finished his business? Where is Lady Musician? He exclaimed that she was missing, and the guys were stunned with horror. Arc clutched his head, unsure what to do. He saw a letter that said if he wanted the musician returned unharmed, he should send the commander-in-chief alone. Casimira said it was a very straightforward threat, and that it had been left where Masumi had disappeared. Was it the work of the neighboring country, Raitia? There had been a lot of suspicious activity on their part lately. Arc replied that he didn't know if that country was behind it, but a magic beast appeared in the city, and while he was dealing with it, she disappeared. It's hard to believe that such a large magical beast would appear in the city, and it wasn't connected to Masumi's disappearance. He wondered if they were just petty jerks, and suddenly jumped up. Casimirius screamed, but where was he going? Arc replied that he wanted to find her. They had written for him to come alone, so that's what he would do. Casimirius shouted at him to calm down. What would happen if anyone found out the commander-in-chief had abandoned his post? The city was already on edge after the wolves' attack, and if this were to come to light, if someone else were to search the city alone, there would be a huge uproar. Arc remained silent, then asked, what was he suggesting then? He should abandon Masumi. Casimirius said they would form a small search party and send it on reconnaissance. The note didn't specify locations, but they clearly wanted to lure him. So the kidnappers must have left some traces. Under the guise of reconnaissance, they would traverse the entire city. How did he like that plan? Arc replied that he needed to hurry and leaned his elbows on the table. Helpless, he didn't know what to do. Casimirius noticed his reaction. When he left the office, he walked straight down the hallway. They understood that if these threats were genuine and the sender was indeed a Raitia spy, then Miss Masumi was in danger. When Arc heard this, he became very angry. Their team began searching the city and lit torches. They went door to door and talked with people, when suddenly everyone saw a brightly shining bird in the sky. Arc stared and realized what it was. Suddenly, Casimirius approached him and shouted, Sir Arc, the search party reports a pink messenger bird flying in this direction. He replied that he had seen it himself, but didn't immediately recall anyone with pink magic. When they urgently needed to contact someone remotely, they could create a servant spirit using their magical power. For someone who bestows magic on others, like the commander-in-chief, such a feat is a simple matter, but for a spark who receives magic, they must undergo the appropriate training to replicate it. Each grantor's unleashed magic has its own unique color, and although the shades may vary, the spark always inherits the grantor's light spectrum. Suddenly, the bird began to land abruptly, and people exclaimed that the birds were heading for the stables. The familiar's color can be used to determine who summoned it. Current commanders of knightly orders almost always use cool colors. Magic orders often have warmer colors, but typically pronounced orange or yellow tones, while red tones have become almost non-existent in recent years. If a generational change had occurred, the successors would certainly have informed them. This means it has no associations with this color. It seems it wasn't one of their own. At that moment, the bird appeared before them, and Casimirius and Arc were stunned. Arc extended his hand toward it, and his hand glowed with a bright light. Then a letter appeared in his hand, and he opened it and said he knew where it was. He didn't know how much he could trust this information, but since there were no other leads, it was worth checking. Casimirius clarified, then they'll send knights there? Arc, no need to make any more noise. This time he'll go alone and leave the cleaning to them. Casimirius called him in bewilderment and asked him to take care of the lady musician. Arc was surprised by these words and replied, okay. After that, he began to ride away, galloping on his horse. He thought that ever since she appeared, everything had gone wrong. Although he suspected her of espionage, who would have thought that the real spy would eventually show up? If this threatening letter really was real and the sender of this spy was a Reitia, then they really had treated Masumi terribly. But what choice did he have? He was the head of the Fourth Knightly Order, and he had people to protect. And as long as there was even the slightest possibility of espionage, he couldn't ignore it. When the extra musician ran away, and he entrusted her with this role, he saw her as a convenient resource. She might well hate him, even if she weren't a spy, and after the direct refusal, they would never meet again, and that was fine with him. But when did this start to bother him? When she played for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace from the overflowing magical power. If not for her music, Casimiria's and the other knights would certainly not have survived. And most of all, her playing comforted him. He caught himself wishing she were still by his side. At that moment, he froze and sensed something was wrong. Who was there? He stopped his horse and stepped to the ground, only to sense her presence. Why was this unpleasant? He was probably no better to Masumi than this scoundrel. Behind the man who grabbed her by the neck, she saw Ark's silhouette. In the dark, dilapidated hut illuminated only by moonlight, his face was barely visible. Did he have an extremely sad expression, or was it just her imagination? When the guy saw Ark, he was surprised. Who would have thought that the commander-in-chief himself would honor him with a visit? Apparently, his invitation was to his liking? Ark replied, yes. He had come to see the face of the man who dared to kidnap his personal musician. She was surprised that he said that, and the guy replied that it was certainly flattering, but in fact, he hadn't intended to kidnap her. More likely, he just wanted to see his confused face, otherwise would he have sent the letter on purpose? And a personal musician, no matter. Don't make him laugh with that phrase. He already knows she's just a temporary musician. She confessed everything to him herself. And what an obedient musician he has. Masumi was dumbfounded by this statement, and Ark became angry and began to attack. He said he'd bought enough time, and that was it, and besides, the harvest today had turned out well. Masumi was surprised by this word and asked again, harvest? The guy left the room and wished him luck. Ark started yelling at him to stop, looking angrily at Masumi. He approached her and asked if she was hurt. She replied no, then thanked him for saving her. Ark replied that it was okay and that they needed to leave. When they returned to the estate, Anshira met them with Casimirias, and they were smiling and happy that everything was fine now. When Ark was alone with Casimirias, he said that everything was clear. Judging by Ms. Masumi's story, the man in black was probably a Reitia spy, but suddenly Masumi started screaming. Who the hell was he? Was he talking nonsense about them without knowing anything? The guys asked her to calm down, and she kept screaming. How could she calm down? She was so angry just remembering. How could they be useless and have a bad reputation? So who even asked him about it? Casimirias replied that he understood her feelings, but that she'd just been saved by too much excitement, which was bad for her health. She should take better care of her own health. And in general, stop calling her mistress and speaking politely. It always makes her cringe. From now on, she will call him Casmi. After that, Casimirias fell silent and didn't know how to act. Ark told her that Casimirias was right and that she needed to calm down first. And besides, his words weren't that far from the truth. Masumi asked again, what was he saying? Wasn't he offended that his knightly order was being humiliated like that? Ark replied that whether he was offended or not, something else was important right now. Masumi asked again, what was he mumbling? She grabbed his shirt and started shouting that he was, after all, the commander-in-chief. An awkward silence ensued between them, and Ark asked why she was so angry. After all, no one had insulted her. He simply pointed out the real state of affairs within the Fourth Knightly Order, and unfortunately, what he said wasn't untrue. For them, these are facts they've been told for almost 10 years. Masumi asked again, if this is a fact, does that mean one can say anything? Is a knight's oath really that insignificant? She has little understanding of the knightly orders and the affairs of this country. And perhaps this is inappropriate, but is his work really worth so little? Is he risking his life, or is she the odd one out who calculates this is an unequal exchange? In any case, she doesn't want him to be discussed by someone who kidnaps people and does nothing but hurl accusations. Following an oath your entire life is incredibly difficult, and it takes a lot of strength. Few people are capable of this. Keeping one's original goal with humility and sincerity, not breaking down in the face of difficulties or giving in to adversity. After all, she herself had given up on her dreams. She's in no position to talk about it, and perhaps it's ultimately just hatred for people like her, but she's not the right person to judge like that. Masumi apologized and said she couldn't repay that jerk, and now she's upset, so she took it out on him. Ark said no, and suddenly she said she'd decided. From now on, she'd become a musician for the Fourth Knight Order. She said this with such pride that Ark was dumbfounded, and Casimirias asked, what? What did she mean? Masumi replied that she meant exactly what she said. She said she'd play for them as their personal musician, and that she'd originally only planned to perform at the initiation ceremony. She suddenly asked, did she say something weird? Casimirias confirmed it more than anything. She'd been suspected of spying all this time, then kidnapped and treated in the most humiliating manner. Masumi replied that she wouldn't argue, and Kasumirias didn't understand, so why was she acting like this? Ark also asked for a question. They'd forced her to play at the initiation ceremony, and before that, she'd insisted she'd never play. Why had she changed her mind now? He looked into her eyes, and Masumi, looking back at him, also lowered her gaze and said it was because she thought it wasn't too late. He'd said he wasn't offended, but he had his own feelings about it. At least, the man she saw that night was exactly like that. As commander-in-chief, he hadn't abandoned the Fourth Knightly Order, and she'd gotten to know them better, and thought that if she could help in any way, she wanted to support them. So she decided she could play again, and perhaps if she stayed, she could find her place. For some reason, she started hoping so. Ark realized she was too serious for espionage, and offered her his hand, causing Masumi to shout, "She's not a spy. How many times do I have to tell you that?" Ark replied that he thought he no longer wanted anything to do with her. He's very sorry for everything that has happened. From now on, he would treat her as their in-house musician and would definitely protect her. That's why he wanted her by his side. And for her to play again. Masumi looked into his eyes in surprise, then shook his hand. "Okay, she'll work as their real in-house musician." Ark replied that he was counting on her then. Masumi confirmed the feeling was mutual. Thus, she became the in-house musician of the Fourth Knightly Order. After a while, the guy who had started running paused by a tree to catch his breath. He realized he'd gotten involved with a problematic woman, but at least he'd seen the face of the commander-in-chief, so it wasn't the worst outcome. He looked at the moon and knew he'd found her, Mrs. Anastasia. After her mother's death, their happy family life came to an end. Her life with her father lasted less than 5 years. She tried to follow her mother's path, becoming a violinist. With each passing year, she began to resemble her more and more in appearance, and her father continued to suffer just looking at her. It was excruciating, and nothing could be done. She decided to move out and said goodbye to her father, telling him to take care of himself. After entering university, she left home, and her father started a new family. He apologized to her for causing so much trouble, but that didn't mean they would never see each other again. If things got tough, she could call anytime. Masumi replied that everything was fine, and if things got tough, she would definitely call. But she never kept that promise. And it wasn't that she didn't love her father. She just didn't want to burden him with another burden. From the moment she graduated from high school until this very moment, she lived alone, and there were no people she wanted to meet, just as there were no people she wanted to miss. After the kidnapping and the conclusion of the Knights tournament, the Fourth Order left the Marino family mansion and headed back to the capital. Masumi said she was very grateful for their hospitality, and Anshira replied that they should be thanking her. She wanted them to stay here as long as possible, and since her mother died, she had seen less and less of her family, so she thought it would be better this way. Masumi understood what she meant and clutched her bag, after which Anshira asked if she could meet her again. Masumi replied that if she wasn't fired, she would come back next year. Anshira asked hopefully, "Is that true?" Masumi replied, "Yes, she promises." Anshira was delighted with this outcome, and then said that it might sound too solemn, but as a sign of their promise, she wanted to give her one thing. She pulled the sheet music out of the envelope, and Masumi was surprised. Anshira explained that it was a keepsake from her mother. People said she received it from a musician before she came to the Marino house. "Miss Musician," she said, "could she take this sheet music with her? And when they meet again, she wants her to play this melody for her. As far as she knows, she can't play, and until now, she hadn't managed to ask anyone to perform this song. But all this time, they had appeared idle, and it was painful for her to watch." Masumi was dumbfounded, then said that she wouldn't mind taking them for safekeeping, but she was sure it was such a valuable thing. Anshira replied, "Yes, Miss Musician," she said. She had saved her entire city and even healed her heart, and she wanted her, the musician she trusted, to play this melody. Masumi was surprised by this and looked closely at the notes, then took them with her, saying, "Okay, she'll definitely keep them, and she'll definitely come back next year to play this melody." Anshira replied, "Okay, thank you very much, Madam Musician." After a while, Masumi found herself in the carriage and fell asleep on the sofa. Kasumirias and Ark sat across from her, and he remarked that she must be tired. It was unlikely she'd be able to properly rest in the carriage. She told him to stop, but Kasumirias continued to say that she wouldn't be able to really rest, but maybe she'd try to get some sleep. Masumi replied that she would. Upon arriving in the capital, she would officially become a musician of the Fourth Order. There wouldn't be any important missions for the time being, but for a musician, they have their hands full, so she should rest while she could. Masumi thought about work and remembered that she hadn't asked what musicians usually do. Honestly, she didn't understand it at all. Ark replied that the knights could demonstrate the results of their daily training. Musicians must provide them with magic on the battlefield. To be ready to perform in any situation, many musicians practice and study new pieces in their free time. She replied that everything was clear and that it resembled preparing for a competition. But Kasumirias asked what they would do with a room and uniform for Ms. Masumi. Ark replied that as soon as they arrived in the capital, he would go to the supply department to allocate a room and issue a uniform. It wouldn't take long, and a workroom would also be needed. The musician had a room free of charge, so let her make use of it. She replied that she was fine, but weren't they tired? After all, they had been working non-stop until their departure. Ark replied that he never tired of underestimating their endurance. How many years did she think they had served in the order? Besides, it was an annual event, and such a workload was nothing. She replied that she wasn't talking about that. After the tournament, the auction began. There were boys for every taste and color. At this point, Casimirias and Ark were stunned by what they heard, and Masumi said she heard that nobles choose their maidens and adopted 100 sons at a knight's tournament. But she hadn't thought the selection continued at the banquet that followed. She thought it was just some kind of graduation party, and never would have imagined that young ladies would stare at knights like a hungry dog at a piece of meat. And yet, the two of them turned out to be the most popular. How did they feel? Ark exclaimed. What kind of feelings could there be? Masumi was surprised by his reaction and asked, so he already has someone? He replied, no, not exactly. And she asked, well then why is he being so cranky? Only the leader of a noble house would do? Casimirias replied that it wasn't a matter of title, but before he could finish, Ark silenced him and he apologized. Masumi noticed this omission, and they asked why she wasn't thinking of finding a partner herself. She grew angry and asked why he was suddenly shifting the blame. He replied that, with her skill, an offer to become his personal musician was quite a lot. Maybe so here, but where she came from, violin skills alone weren't enough to find a partner. The guys asked again, really? She replied, really. But that's it, she'll be sleeping, so when they get to the inn or somewhere else, have them wake her up. After that, she lay down on the pillow and fell asleep. The guys replied, okay. And, falling asleep, she thought that she no longer needs anyone by her side. As long as she had this violin, she'd somehow survive. Although she still felt strange. She would never have thought that the violin she played only for herself would suddenly turn out to be really needed by someone. It looks like hard times lie ahead. After a while, the guy approached the door, opened it, entered the room, and said, he's back, Her Highness Anastasia. She smiled and said, welcome back, Reino. She was so glad he was safe. Reino smiled and said, he swore he'd definitely come back. Anastasia rose from her chair and said, yes, but he's always so reckless. She was worried. Reino said, he knows his limits. That's why he refused to engage in combat with the Commander-in-Chief of the 4th Knightly Order. Anastasia screamed, with the Commander-in-Chief? She clutched her chest and said, so it was because of her that he was in danger. It was all because she said she wanted to know more about him, about Prince Arquestavev. Reino took her hand, knelt down and said, he's her knight. It's the highest honor for him to fulfill her wish. Anastasia smiled and thanked Reino. Reino said, by the way, while he was gone, he heard that 3 marriage proposals had come in. Anastasia shook her head and said she'd rejected them all. She didn't need it now. Reino stood up and replied, I understand. He approached her and asked if he could help her put on her shawl. She needed to rest, otherwise it would affect her health. Anastasia replied that she'd been thinking about the military music festival and couldn't sleep. Reino sighed and said, yes, speaking of the festival, the musician she summoned for the tournament. Anastasia turned around and asked, really? Where is it? They looked everywhere and couldn't find it. She'd already decided the summoning had been a failure. Reino said he believed she'd succeed. For a mage of her level, summoning one person was a piece of cake. Anastasia nudged him and ordered him to stop. You can't say things like that. She approached the window, and Reino asked, so, her decision hasn't changed? Anastasia replied, of course. She had already made up her mind the moment she was summoned. There was no turning back. She would never give up on winning the tournament. After all, if she won, her dream would come true. So let him tell her where the musician she summoned was. Reino clenched his fist and said, he will tell you. But he was afraid the situation was unpleasant. Anastasia asked again, what did he mean? Reino replied, the musician had ended up in Alberic. Moreover, she was now under the protection of the Commander-in-Chief of the 4th Knightly Order. The musician she summoned possessed superb skill. Do you think a person would pass up such talent? Anastasia said, Prince Arquestavev. Reino thought, his mistress had fallen in love. And not with just anyone, but with a man from the enemy country of Alberic, and one who occupied an important post there, no less. Anastasia said she wouldn't back down. She would definitely win the festival and get him no matter what. Reino sighed and said as she commanded, why did he still feel it even at moments like these? He was incapable of resisting her. He bowed and said he would gladly become her hands and feet. Reino thought, a princess and a knight. A love doomed to failure from the start. The princess doesn't know her knight's true feelings, and most likely she never will. Sometime later, in Alberic, MC looked at herself in the mirror. She adjusted her scarf and smiled. She said, well then, 10 days had passed since her arrival in the capital, and her day as a full-time musician was beginning again. Sometime later, in a cafe, a man said to look at this scarf. Is this her, the one they were talking about? Masumi approached the food counter, and someone asked why the musician was even here. She thought, is this really so strange? Musicians usually eat not in the dining hall, but in their private rooms. Knights and mages come here, of course, but mostly those who work behind the scenes are here. And you won't see any musicians here at all, she thought, so their whispers are understandable. But when they offer her to eat alone in a private room, it's a little awkward. She's not a noblewoman after all. Having become a full-time musician of the Fourth Knightly Order, she came here, to the imperial capital, and since then she restores magical energy to the knights every day. Some time ago, Ark said this is her personal musician's office. Masumi asked in surprise, will she have her own office? Ark answered, yes, but when the knights come here, she needs to restore their magic. Otherwise, she can use it as she sees fit. And since then, the knights began to come almost every day. The guys asked to restore magic, to play, or to help. Masumi looked at them displeasedly, and then played. Currently, she ate and thought. 10 days had already passed. She didn't even notice. Curious glances were still present, but she thought they would get used to it with time. At that moment, a man approached her and apologized. He asked if he could join her. Masumi turned around and said, Sir Serge, good morning. Of course, he can sit wherever he wants. Serge Valles smiled and thanked her. He once held the highest position in the Fourth Knightly Order, a holy knight. He had already retired, but remained in the order as a mentor and was greatly trusted. Masumi looked at him and thought, he always spoke to her easily and naturally, and thanks to this, she gradually began to communicate with the other knights. Serge asked if she was finishing her meal yet. Masumi replied, no, she had just started eating. Serge looked at her in surprise and asked, is that all? She ate little. Masumi laughed and said, but compared to him, Sir Serge, this is quite enough for her. Serge asked how she managed to play so well with such a diet. MC replied that, unlike him, she practically didn't exercise. Serge asked again, really? She plays from morning until night. He couldn't do that. Thanks to her, the knights no longer lack magic and can give it their all during training. They are truly very grateful to her. Masumi was slightly embarrassed to hear this. After a while, they left the dining room and Serge asked if she had already gotten used to life here. MC answered yes, she was somehow coping. At first, she wandered around all the time, but now she got her bearings better. Serge said that was good. MC thought that, unlike the times when she was suspected of spying, now she could freely move around anywhere. Serge asked if she would stay in her room all day today. Masumi answered yes. And what are his plans, Sir Serge? He replied that after lunch there was general training, but if there were anyone interested, he was ready to conduct individual lessons. He heard sounds coming from the building and said, the early risers seem to have already started. Masumi peeked out from behind him and said, yeah, you could even hear them from his room. It's good when it's so lively here. Serge started to stretch and said, well, he'll go and stretch after eating. Could he come see her during the break? Masumi said, of course, she'll wait. She adjusted her hair and thought, he's so friendly, and yet his skills are considered one of the best in the country. He must really be an incredible person. After a while, she stretched and said, well, it's time for her to get back to work too. The MC opened the window and thought, they're trying their best. She walked into the room and sighed, sitting down on a chair. Masumi thought, so where did she leave off yesterday? Musicians don't have strictly defined responsibilities. To be ready to perform in any situation, many musicians practice and study new pieces in their free time. Even though Ark said it, it sounds too vague. She thinks everyone has their own approach. So the first thing she decided to do was write down the sheet music. After all, sheet music is impossible to get here. Everything related to musicians is top secret, and except for the untitled score that Anshira gave her, she doesn't have a single piece from this world. Masumi picked up a pen and thought, it's troublesome, but it can't be helped. Perhaps the magic recovery effect varies depending on the melody. She wants to expand her repertoire. She needs to write down the pieces she knows before she forgets. Suddenly, she heard a sound from the street and froze in surprise. She turned around and asked, what is that? MC put down the violin and went to the window. She saw smoke and thought, I can't see well. There was a scream. Miss Masumi. She turned around and clutched her face, thinking about how terrible the wounds were. She asked, Sir Serge. A loud sound came from the training grounds. What happened? Serge apologized for barging in like that. Is there any free space where they can be placed? Masumi answered excitedly. Yes, over there. Serge frowned and said there wasn't enough space. He asked Masumi to excuse him. It was an emergency. They'll have to move them a bit. MC replied, okay. After a while, he arranged the knights around the room, and Masumi looked around and thought, there were so many people. Casimirias entered the room and asked what happened. MC rushed to him, and Serge said it was his mistake as a mentor. During training, the 5th group of squires was hit. Casimirias asked again, hit? What kind of hit? Serge answered, he never imagined they would be there. He was sure there was no one, so he unhesitatingly used an area attack. Casimirias folded his arms and asked, is this because of him, Sir Serge? They had only recently joined the order. They weren't supposed to be in the restricted area. The 4 of them should have marked the boundaries of the sector at the training grounds. No, it was his fault too. He hadn't taken that into account either. Serge grabbed his neck and said, what a nightmare. If only the state had provided their order with more training grounds. He turned to Miss Masumi. She replied, yes. Serge said he would use healing magic on them. He didn't know how long it would take, but until they recovered, could she restore his magic? MC replied, yes, of course. She asked to wait a second and went to her violin. She picked it up and thought, this is the first time since she arrived in the capital that such an emergency has happened. She knew that, having become a musician, she would encounter situations like this. The same thing happened at the tournament when the magic beasts attacked. She said everything was fine. She could handle it. She looked around and walked forward. After a while, she was lying on her hands on the table when Ark entered the room. He stroked her head and asked if she was awake. He heard she was here. He came in to check, but she was sleeping. Masumi rubbed her eyes and replied that today had been a hard day. Ark said he had already heard about it from Kasumirias. Thanks to her, they were able to apply the healing faster, and the worst was avoided. He sat down on a chair and said that everyone would be back in action soon. Thank you. MC replied that she had done nothing wrong. That was her job as a musician. Although she understood it, she was scared. Her hands were shaking. Ark said that she had still managed to play. Without her, everything would have taken much longer, as befits a musician. Masumi asked to listen. Does this happen often? Such serious injuries during training? Ark replied that, no. Actually, this shouldn't be the case. There are designated areas for using magic during training, and access to them is limited to prevent harm to others. Masumi said, well then. Ark said their training grounds aren't commensurate with the scale of the order. Compared to the number of knights and the total amount of magic, it's too small. MC told him to expand it, and Ark said it wasn't them who made the decision, but the state. They'd already raised this issue, but no one listened to them. Until now, magic training was minimal to conserve magic, so this area was barely enough. But thanks to it, they can now restore magic, and in recent days, the training has become more intense. As a result, Masumi interrupted him and said, and the grounds which were already at capacity immediately increased their capacity. Ark answered, exactly. Now he doesn't intend to remain silent anymore. No matter how much the higher-ups resist, he doesn't intend to give in either. Masumi clenched her fists and said, the fourth knightly order, she sees, isn't being spoiled too much. Ark looked at her and said, yes, she's tired today. Let her go to her room and rest. Masumi asked again, and he? Ark replied, he still has things to do. MC looked at him carefully and then began to leave. After a while, Kasumirias entered the room and said, Sir Ark, here he is. Ark asked how things were going on that matter. Kasumirias replied, it looks like there's a chance that the training ground issue will be looked into. Ark said, that's great. Kasumirias said, and also, there's a report concerning Ms. Masumi. It looks like the higher-ups have noticed her. After a while, Masumi was writing down notes and playing the violin. She stretched when suddenly a voice rang out. Is she finished? The guys were sitting behind her, and Serge said, they're musician. She's working very hard. MC turned around and shouted, Sir Serge! And all of them, since when have they been here? Serge replied, it's been about an hour, I think. Masumi screamed. They should have at least called out to her. Serge grinned and said, no problem. He, on the contrary, concealed his presence so as not to disturb her. He offered her some tea. She was probably tired. She approached him and took the cup. She asked, so, now they have 2 training grounds? Someone blurted it out. Although the incident with Serge was the reason. The main thing is that everything ended well. The higher-ups couldn't hush it up, but nothing has been decided yet. 2 days have passed since the knights suffered from the magic unleashed by Sir Serge. They say the state has accepted the complaint of the 4th Knightly Order and is seriously considering expanding the training grounds. Masumi thought it was difficult for everyone right now. When veterans gather, conversations inevitably turn to memories of the past. But even among them, there is a topic that particularly touches the heart of the matter. The guy said that the very fact that there is now an opportunity for expansion represents enormous progress. He remembers the times when they would skimp on everything just to hire a musician. The knight said, and indeed, back then they were willing to do anything just to get a musician. There was even a guy who handed in documents on the back of drafts. His boss later scolded him because it was unclear which side was the front. Another guy said, yes, he remembers. He looked at MC and said, but thanks to her coming to them, it won't have to come to this again. Masumi screamed, what is he saying? She hasn't done much yet. He shouldn't thank her. Serge interrupted her and told her not to say stupid things. If it weren't for her, this incident could have ended much more seriously. So this gratitude is well deserved. Masumi thought, is that so? So she really was useful. She needs to try to make sure something like this never happens again. Suddenly, Ark entered the room and said to forgive him for interrupting their rest. Kasumirias said, but it's urgent. Masumi. Ark said the commander of the court knightly order had summoned them. They were leaving immediately. Masumi pointed at herself and asked, her? She ran out of the office and asked him to wait. And why do they need her? Is it because of the incident the day before yesterday? Kasumirias replied, no, everything is going smoothly with that. MC asked, then why? Kasumirias replied, it's because he appointed a person of unknown origin as a full-time musician. They were demanding an explanation. Masumi asked, is a musician's origin really that important? Kasumirias replied, no. It's usually overlooked. Besides, the very fact of hiring a full-time musician doesn't require a separate report to the higher-ups. But this time, there was a reason why they were obliged to appear. MC looked at him in surprise and thought, the court knightly order. So it's related to the royal family? That sounds very important. She clenched her fists and wondered why she had such a bad feeling. After some time, they arrived at the castle, and she said that she thought she had already gotten used to the size of the capital's buildings, but the palace was a completely different level. Ark said the place was needlessly pompous. They needed it to finish quickly and return. MC thought it was huge. She wondered why Ark was so angry. They stopped and Ark said, "There." He waved his hand and attacked with magic somewhere to the side. Masumi asked, "Why?" She looked in surprise towards where a snake appeared. She screamed, "What? What kind of snake is that?" Ark answered, "It's the guardian of the garden, serpent. It was hidden by an invisibility spell. It watches everyone who comes here, constantly exerting pressure with a magical aura. For those with little magic, this pressure is so strong that they can lose consciousness. Therefore, she should not take off her scarf under any circumstances." This palace is the heart of the Albaric Empire, the residence of the king and royal family, where the strictest magical recognition systems are in place. The scarf is the key. If she loses it, Serpent will consider her an enemy and immediately attack. Masumi grabbed the scarf and replied, she understood. There are many buildings in the capital that ordinary people can't easily enter. They are all protected by recognition magic. The same applies to the Order's territory, so Ark imbued his magic into this scarf so she could move freely. Masumi thought, so this scarf is even more important here than on the Order's territory. They walked forward, and MC carefully looked at the snake. After a while, Ark knocked on the door, and a voice came from behind them. Her most respectful greeting, Lord Arkrestov. They turned and saw the girl who said that he had dispelled Serpent's invisibility. It was lucky that it didn't perceive them as intruders. Next time, it won't happen. Ark smirked and asked, so, does that mean she forgives me this time? The deputy commander of the Court Order of Magicians is known for her generosity. Masumi looked around and thought, so this is the deputy head of the Order of Mages. Ark stepped forward and said that he personally wouldn't mind settling the matter right now, but he was getting pretty tired of the petty skirmishes with them. He released mana in the form of a bird, and the deputy asked if he was really ready to bet the Azure Eagle. If the Court Order of Mages didn't change its position, she would agree to that too. Ark said, taking this opportunity, he would say that the wings of his Fourth Order cannot be broken. And one mustn't forget that in terms of their status, they are equal. The girl said that he was still as hot-tempered. Unfortunately, she didn't have time to deal with him. She had already been notified. The staff musician of the Fourth Knightly Order wanted to talk to her. Masumi looked at her questioningly and asked again. With her, the girl replied that since she became a full-time musician for the Fourth Knightly Order, it meant she knew their inner workings, their past. Masumi thought, past. Is she talking about what that man said? She asked, the order that exhausts musicians to death? Is that what she's talking about? The deputy replied, that's just one side of the coin. She asks if she understands what impact the Fourth Order has had on the country, what damage it has caused by using musicians as expendable material. They, the Magic Corps, protect the people from enemies, and the Knightly Orders serve as a shield and protect the mages. Only when the system works smoothly does the country gain a solid foundation, but the Fourth Knightly Order is completely failing to fulfill its duties. Moreover, it only gets in the way. MC interrupted her and said, in Westov, if it weren't for Arkrestov, the initiation ceremony would have ended in disaster. And all of this happened only because they didn't have a musician. The girl asked, so what? She thinks that if she's around, everything will be okay? Does she think she's a hero? MC screamed, it's not like that. The deputy said, okay, she doesn't care what she says. She only came because of rumors about a new musician, but it seems she's not even worth talking about. Lord Arkrestov. He said that the Magic Corps and the Knightly Orders are equal, but that was in the past. The fact that they still hold this worthless shield at court is only possible because the Magic Corps also performs the duties of knights. Let him not forget that, that's all. Masumi ordered them to wait. The conversation is not yet. At that moment, the deputy waved her hand and disappeared. MC asked what kind of person she is anyway. Ark replied, who knows? She's known for being impossible to pin down. No need to bother your head. He said to go to the head of the Court Knightly Order. Masumi smiled and answered, yes. They walked down the corridor, and Masumi thought, the Magic Corps and the Knightly Orders are equal, but that was in the past. The Fourth Knightly Order completely fails to fulfill its duties. Moreover, it only gets in the way. Equality is a complicated thing. Is there a musician or not? Do they fulfill their duties? Who takes responsibility for whom? Even if he thinks he is on an equal footing, in reality he has to make concessions. And when he is unaware of the other side's concessions, he thinks that he is the only one at a loss and conflicts arise. Masumi thought this is all difficult. Living alone is simple, but if she lives in society, then ultimately it is impossible. It is impossible to avoid interaction with people or disputes. How many concessions have they made to her so far? How many people has she caused trouble? The very thought makes her breathe hard. After a while, they entered the hall and the man said, finally, they have arrived. He was late, Ark. Masumi thought, so this is the head of the Court Knightly Order? Ark asked. Why are they all here? Were they really attacked from Raite? The guy looked at Casimires and asked. He didn't explain anything at all? For a guard captain, that's simply disgraceful. Ark smirked and said, he's joking. Does he really have no sense of humor? The man said he heard there was a ruckus in his circle, and he demands an explanation for it right now. It looks like he's acquired a full-time musician, one of unknown origin at that. Ark replied, yes, they really did sign an exclusive contract. The man asked why he hadn't reported it. Ark asked, what do you mean? Usually, there's no requirement to report when acquiring a musician, is there? The man replied, Their fourth order is different from other orders. Since there's a risk of ruining the musician again, he should have reported it in advance. Didn't he even think of that? And this despite the fact that they still haven't achieved any decent results. Ark clenched his fist in irritation and said, "How can he talk so much?" Masumi looked around and wondered, "The glass is shaking. An earthquake?" Ark replied that he understood that he was giving the fourth order special attention, but he asked that they not interfere excessively. The man said that meant this staff musician was especially dear to him. There was no need to get so attached. Ark asked if he thought they had gone without a musician of their own free will. They had been demanding at least one for a long time. The man said yes, that had happened, but he didn't recall ever ordering them not to keep a musician with them. Ark dropped his chair in irritation and shouted. Could he say the same while looking into the eyes of the families of the fallen? Masumi clutched her head in fear. Ark put his hands on the table and said that he didn't care how good he was. The main thing was that he was there. In past battles, there were plenty of people who could have been saved if only their magical energy had been replenished. And yet it was they, the Palace Knights, who had declared back then that they didn't need to waste such a valuable resource on them. And now he, with such a pompous face, declares that he should have reported to him. They don't owe them anything, so he should stop this circus. The guy screamed. How dare he? Does he think he can get away with this? Ark asked. Does he want to punish him? Let him punish him. If they really think that a pathetic, spineless knightly order that only knows how to sit around in the capital can replace them, go ahead. The guy looked at him and asked, is he really going that far? Well, then he should respond in kind. He created a lion behind him which rushed towards the eagle. Kasumirias covered MC with his body and asked, Miss Masumi, is she okay? She thanked him and widened her eyes in surprise. Ark stood in front of the man. A scratch appeared on his face. He folded his arms across his chest and said, impressive as always. But he thinks that's enough. Ark said, yes, they have already taken up enough of their time. He asked for forgiveness, he lost his temper, but he hoped they understood them now. The man replied, okay, he'll turn a blind eye to it today, but let it never happen again. Masumi wondered what that was just now. That light, that strong wind. Was it connected to Ark's emotions? Something similar had happened during his clash with the deputy head of the magic corps. Ark walked forward and said, Masumi, Kasumirias, they're leaving. MC looked at him carefully and said, yes. Ark turned around and said, yes. He completely forgot to tell them. This year, he'll also be fielding his own full-time musician in the battle music tournament. The man asked again, what? Ark replied, of course he'll be taking part in the tournament himself. The winner of the battle music tournament is granted whatever they wish. He hoped they hadn't forgotten. With this musician of unknown origin, it would be fun to cleanse this rotten knightly order in one fell swoop. Masumi thought, a music tournament? What is this anyway? Was she going to take part too? She looked at him carefully and thought, did no one actually say a word to her about this? After a while she screamed, what kind of tournament is this anyway? And why is this the first time she hears that she will be participating in it? Ark, let him say at least something. Kasumirias asked her to calm down, and she ordered him to stop calling her mistress. She looked at him and asked him to wait. He is bleeding. Kasumirias touched his head with his palm and said, yes. Masumi said, does it mean he got hurt while covering her? Is he okay? He needs to be treated quickly. What should she do? She didn't take her violin with her. Kasumirias replied, there is a lot of blood, so it seems serious, but it's just a scratch. If you treat it in the order's infirmary, everything will be fine. So Mistress Masumi doesn't need to worry. MC screamed. What is he even talking about? If someone is injured, of course she will be worried. And Kasumirias lowered his head, and Masumi said, it's also his fault, Ark. He has to say something. Ark, where is he going alone? Kasumirias got hurt because of him. She followed him and asked if he was even listening to her. She grabbed his jacket and screamed. She told him to stop. Didn't he hear? Ark turned around and looked at MC's irritated face. She said she understood that the court order commander's words had hurt him, but he should at least look around a little. Ark replied, yes, let her forgive him. Kasumirias approached her and said, Miss Masumi, you shouldn't shout like that in the hallway. Masumi asked for forgiveness, but she couldn't help herself. Ark looked at him and asked if he was hurt. Kasumirias replied, the wound wasn't serious, just a splinter grazed him. MC thought, so he didn't even notice? That means that conversation with the commander had really affected him. Ark said it seems because of him. Kasumirias interrupted him and said that it was his fault that he couldn't dodge. No need to worry. Ark remained silent, and Masumi looked at him and said that she didn't want Kasumirias to go alone, and since it was his fault, Ark would take him to the infirmary. Ark asked, what will she do? Masumi replied that, since she came, she would take a walk around the palace. When they are finished, they will meet here. What? No need to look at her like that. She's not a child, she won't get lost. Ark replied, no, that's not the point. He is worried about something completely different. Kasumirias asked Mrs. Masumi, when she walks around the palace, not to take off this scarf under any circumstances. MC waved her hand and told them to go. The guys walked ahead, and then turned around. Masumi shouted, let them go. She waved her hand at them, and after a while she went outside. She started looking around and thought she expected the palace to be huge, but this was way out of the ordinary. She only walked through a few buildings and for some reason ended up in the courtyard. And anyway, her legs already hurt. Where should she sit? She saw a bench and thought, she'll rest for a bit and then ask someone for directions. Masumi sat on the bench and looked around. She thought, Ark was acting strange today. He had been stubborn before, but today he clearly lost his composure. To react so sharply to the commander's words, weren't they just superior and subordinate? She doesn't know anything about Ark at all. In fact, he never tells anyone anything about himself, and about this tournament either. Shouldn't he have explained in advance what this was all about? She wanted to ask him, but seeing his state, she stretched and said, she hoped that when they met again, he would have calmed down. At that moment, a shout was heard behind her. No need to make eyes at him. Masumi turned and peeked out from behind the bushes. Grace said she didn't do anything wrong. She was just following the orders given by the head musician. MC hid behind a bush and thought, the head musician and this uniform, are they really musicians too? The girl hit her and said she was a terrible fool and was behaving so arrogantly. She deliberately flirted with Keith so that he would assign her this way, right? She took her regular customer, and now she's making excuses. Leftera tore her scarf off, and Grace, frightened, asked for it back. Leftera threw the scarf into a puddle, and Grace fell to her knees when suddenly Leftera stepped on her hand and told her to forgive her. She didn't even notice her hand was there, and the scarf got dirty, poor thing. But it's all her fault, the thief. Suddenly there was a scream. Enough! MC ran forward and covered Grace with her body. She frowned and asked, isn't she ashamed to step on a person's hands? They're both musicians after all. Leftera asked who the hell she was. She looked like a musician, but her face was unfamiliar. And the color of this scarf, the azure sky, the fourth knightly order. Masumi frowned and said yes, she was from the fourth knightly order. So what? Leftera looked at her with displeasure, then turned away and started to leave. MC extended her hand to Grace and asked if she could get up. Grace thanked her and said, but she would get her hands dirty. MC replied, it's okay. Grace replied, no. She stood up, bowed and said, thank you for helping. Really? Thank you. Masumi replied, no need for thanks. Is your hand okay? Maybe we should go to the infirmary? Grace said not to worry. She can't leave here. MC screamed, did she also twist her ankle? Then she'll call someone now. Grace screamed in fear. No, that's not it. She covered her mouth with her hands, and Masumi looked at her in surprise. Grace said sheepishly, they took her scarf. She won't be able to pass the recognition. Masumi replied, so that's it. She thought he came up with it himself. But it turns out other musicians also use such measures to get in. She said to forgive her. She was so angry at that woman that she didn't even think about the scarf. Grace replied, no, it's her fault. She let it be taken away too easily. Masumi thought, this is the courtyard. To get somewhere, you need to go through the building. And there is recognition magic there, and you need a scarf to get in. Masumi asked, what if the two of us go out together using her scarf? Grace replied, you can't. One scarf only works for one person. MC turned away and said, one scarf only for one person. Grace looked at her hands and said, she can't waste the time of the musician of the azure sky. She'll manage somehow. She can go ahead. MC looked at her in surprise and asked, so what? Grace looked down and said her roommate would come looking for her tonight. MC asked, will she be here alone until then? Besides, she was hurt. She can't leave her like this. She started untying her scarf and asked, she said one scarf only works on one person, right? Grace looked at it questioningly and answered, yes, and if you tear it in half, there will be two scarves. Grace asked again, what? Well, MC asked again, we should try, shouldn't we? The main thing is to get out of here. Well, no one will die from them tearing it. Grace rushed forward and asked her to wait. That's how she met Grace. And this was the beginning of a grand event called the Combat Music Tournament. A scarf is an indispensable item given to musicians so they can move freely inside buildings with a strict magical access system. Only the Order's commanders have the right to issue this, and only one copy is allowed per person. Losing it is unthinkable, and damaging it even more so. After a while, Ark said irritably, there is a lot he wants to say. So much, he doesn't know where to start. Why did she tear it? Masumi answered fearfully, well, the thing is, she heard that one scarf only works on one person and thought, what if we make two out of it? Ark replied that if a torn scarf retained access, everyone would have been doing it a long time ago. MC replied that if you think about it, he's right, but she was hoping that maybe it would work. Ark screamed loudly, it's bad for her to think. MC covered herself with her hands in fear and said, well, you don't have to be so angry. Ark screamed, of course you do. It's good that he installed an alarm on the scarf, so he immediately felt it and ran, and managed to let her into the building. If he was late, the binding spell would have worked. Let her imagine if the personal musician of the 4th Knightly Squad had failed the security check. It would be an unprecedented disgrace. Grace asked them to wait. Everyone turned to look at her, and Grace said, it is not the fault of the lady musician of the azure sky. It is her fault. She accidentally lost her scarf, and having no solution, said that she would remain in the inner garden alone. She only showed concern. All responsibility lies with her. If they want to punish someone, let them punish her. Ark narrowed his eyes and asked, is she a court musician? Grace replied, yes. Let them forgive her for not introducing herself right away. Her name is Grace Gowdy. This time she has caused so much trouble for the commander-in-chief of the 4th Knightly Order, the captain of the guard, and the lady musician of the azure sky. She sincerely apologizes. Casimirias asked again, Gowdy, is she by any chance related to the Holy Knight Richard Gowdy of the First Order? She replied, he is her brother. Ark answered thoughtfully, Gowdy, a famous ancient family, a renowned family of musicians. Masumi, he'll turn a blind eye to it this time. He asked for the other half of the torn scarf. She handed it to him and asked, okay, but why? He replied, he'll make a temporary pass. Grace cried out, what? But Lord Commander, he doesn't have to. Ark told her not to worry. He told Casimirias to take her to the infirmary and take care of the wound. Casimirias replied, he'll obey. Ark handed her the scarf and said it was temporary. Let her get a new one from the head of the court knights as soon as possible. Grace thanked him, and Casimirias said, well, they can go then. Grace said she was truly sorry for causing everyone so much trouble. Casimirias asked her not to worry. The infirmary was very close, and they couldn't leave the wounded woman without help. Besides, they owe a lot to Mr. Richard. Let her allow them to repay the debt. Guy slipped down and then put her hand in Casimirias' palm and said, then she will take advantage of his kindness. Ark looked around and said, well, finally it's over. He helped MC up and said, Masumi, it's time for them to go too. She turned away and replied, yes. The next day, Grace was standing in the library and looking through the books. Masumi happily peeked out from behind the bookcase and said, she finally found it. Grace cried out in surprise, Madam Musician of the Azure Sky? Why is she here? Masumi replied she wanted to see her, so she came to the palace. She was not allowed alone, so Casimirias came with her. Yesterday someone stepped on her hand. She was very worried. Brr musician, hands are a treasure. Grace said shyly, thank you very much, Madam Musician of the Azure Sky. MC asked if she could tell if everything worked out afterwards. Well, with all the consequences. Grace replied that the captain of the guard stood up for her, so there was no serious punishment, and a new pass would be issued soon. Masumi said she was glad. Casimirias seems strict, but he can be relied on, and if he tried so hard, it's because of Richard, right? Her brother must have helped them a lot. Grace answered, probably. MC asked if she was close to her brother. She's an only child, so she doesn't know what it's like to have a brother or sister. Grace replied that they had a big age difference, so he spoiled her a lot. Her mother was weak, and it was unusual for a noble family to have only 2 of them. He took her with him everywhere. If she started crying, he would immediately come running. He's a very reliable older brother. They studied music together, but her brother didn't like it and he decided to become a knight early on. MC said that's why he's a knight and not a musician. Grace said that, although their family is famous for its musicians, no one is forced to become a musician. Ultimately, it turned out to be the right decision. Grace's brother, Richard Gaudy, soon after 10 years of training, entered the palace of the Knights' Apprentices, and upon reaching adulthood, was initiated into the First Order and became a knight. Grace never forgot that beautiful scene at the initiation. She fell in love with the musicians, whose magnificent music filled the ceremonial hall, and dreamed of becoming a musician who could stand alongside the knights. She wanted to become a court musician and become a support for her brother in the First Order. Grace said that when she came of age, she entered service at court. Her first job was with the Order of Court Magicians, although she hoped to receive assignments from the First Order as well, but she was always assigned only to the magicians. Recently, they even offered to become their permanent musician. Of course, she was pleased to be needed, but if she accepted, she would no longer be able to work with the First Order. MC asked if she refused. Grace answered yes. But because of this, the other musicians began to consider her arrogant. Now they find fault with everything. A person's actions affect the family's honor, and she feels embarrassed in front of her brother. But she also can't give up her dream. Masumi felt sorry for Grace, and at the same time felt a little heavy in her heart. After stories about the ceremony and on Shira's words, she understood that musicians are rare and proud people, demanding of those around them. But everything turned out to be more complicated than she thought. Their world is very small, and even between musicians, relationships can be harsh. It was the same in her old world. The darker the world, the harsher the order. Even if she strives to become a professional violinist, skill alone is not enough. Relationships with people, reputation, and the opinions of others also influence fate. This was not the main reason why she gave up a professional path, but she has few pleasant memories of it. And yet, despite everything, Grace tries with all her might to remain a musician. She simply envied her perseverance. Grace clutched her head and told her to forgive her for taking so long to tell her all this. MC smiled and said, Masumi. Her name is Masumi. She really came because she was worried, but she also wanted to talk to her. She doesn't have many friends, and she doesn't have any musician friends in this country, so she was glad to get to know her better. She took her hand and asked if she would be her friend, not Mrs. Musician of the Azure Sky, but so that they would call each other by their first names, become friends who can listen to problems. She knows, sometimes it's easier just from being listened to. She might not be able to solve her problem, but she could share her feelings as a friend. She looked closely at Grace and asked, May I? Grace hesitated and replied, Well, she felt better after listening to her. Until now, she couldn't tell anyone about this, not even her family. If she allows, she wants to be her friend, Masumi. The girls smiled and MC screamed, of course. After a while, the girls were sitting at the table, and Masumi said, and anyway, she knows she really is amazing, Grace. She asked again. What? MC asked. Even though she has no luck and a difficult situation, the fact that everyone wants to get her means that her talent is recognized. Right? Grace said that it is only thanks to her family and the fact that she was lucky with her teacher. Masumi said that following a strong teacher is also difficult. Her mentor was also outstanding, but she barely kept up with him. She rarely got good grades. Grace said, but she often hears about her skill. Everyone says that the Fourth Order has received an incredible musician, and that she will participate in the battle music tournament. Masumi lowered her head and said, Grace, she wants to ask something. May I? Grace answered of course if she can answer. Masumi asked, this battle music tournament, what is it anyway? Grace looked at her puzzledly and asked, does she know nothing about the tournament? Masumi answered, yes. Ark didn't explain anything and simply said that she was participating. She wasn't really against it, but she'd like to know what it was. He kept avoiding the answer. Grace replied, yes. She wasn't sure she was competent enough, but if she allowed it, she'd tell her. MC happily said, yes, please. Grace said, well, the combat tournament is a diplomatic event held jointly by their country, Alberic, and neighboring Letea. As the name suggests, it consists of two parts, military and musical. In the military part, knights and mages participate in tournament duels, and in the musical part, a competition among musicians. In the military part, there's a risk of injury, but in the musical part, there's no such danger. Unless the performance is terrible, you can permanently lose your job and your place at court. Masumi screamed. What? Such things really happen? That's too strict. Grace said, no, it happens extremely rarely. She thought she'd be fine. Masumi replied, she'd like to believe it, but still, she didn't expect it to be a diplomatic event. She thought it was something like a knighting ceremony. Grace said this tournament is held every year to strengthen relations between countries. There is a truce between their countries now, so events like this are extremely important for the future of peace. Masumi wondered, for the future of peace? It's much more serious than she thought. From Grace's further explanation, it became clear that Alberic and Letea are disputing the right to own part of a resource-rich border. They had been at war for many years, but the armed conflict had greatly exhausted both sides. Therefore, for the sake of peace, they finally agreed to a ceasefire. Grace said that, of course, the country's honor is at stake, but the details of the truce will be announced at the tournament. Therefore, neither the military nor the musical parts can be slacking off. Masumi? What's wrong with her? MC thought irritably. Ark, you idiot. After a while, she walked into the office and yelled, such important things need to be warned in advance. Ark looked at her carefully and asked, what is she talking about? He heard she went to meet the daughter of the House of Gaudi. Did something happen? Maybe she. Masumi screamed, tournament. She learned everything from Grace. Ark asked again, tournament? What does this have to do with now? They exchanged glances, and Ark asked, didn't he explain? MC screamed, nothing at all. He decided without her, without explaining a word. She thought he would tell her later, but he still remains silent. And it turns out this is a super important event. Let him learn to talk. Ark said, it's his fault. MC frowned, and Ark said this is not an excuse, but he simply didn't have time to calmly explain everything. He wanted to explain later, but forgot. He offers his sincere apologies. Masumi turned around and said, she sees that he is busy. Let him forgive her for yelling. She didn't mean to complicate things. Ark said, no, this time it's his fault. Casimirias, he can go. He's on his own from now on. Casimirias left the room and said, he understood. Masumi asked, but why should she participate? It's a diplomatic event, after all. Ark replied, that's exactly why. If she demonstrates her skills at such an important event, she'll dispel any doubts the courtiers have about her, and that will significantly strengthen her position. MC said that was fine, of course, but wouldn't his or the Fourth Order's reputation suffer because of her? Ark asked again, was she really worried about that? He believed in her skills, which he'd seen in Westov. That's why he decided to let her participate. MC turned and looked at him carefully. She said, when he speaks so bluntly, that's good. Ark said it was good that she stopped by. To participate in the tournament selection, you need to submit an application indicating your musical biography. He handed over the application and said, so, I need her help filling out a few fields. Masumi read it. Her name was Fudo Masumi, and her citizenship was the Alberic Empire. She asked to listen. The citizenship column said, Alberic Empire, but she didn't remember ever receiving citizenship. Ark said he'd completed all the paperwork. To participate in the tournament, you need to have Alberic citizenship. MC asked again, is that possible? She wasn't from around here. Ark replied that whether she was born in Alberic wasn't that important. He himself only had citizenship, not a purebred Alberic. Masumi asked again, is that true? He replied, yes, his mother hails from a border tribe. It's now imperial territory, but it used to be a separate small state. He looked up and met Masumi's gaze. Ark asked why she was looking at him like that. She replied that he was simply telling her something about himself for the first time. He asked. Is that so? Masumi replied, of course. He only talks about the order, but never brings up other topics. She had never heard of him or his past. Ark asked, is that why she was looking at him like that? Her face seemed to glow. She replied that it wasn't that she was happy, but that she was pleased because she learned something about him she hadn't known before. Ark was surprised and realized she was happy over such a trivial matter, and Masumi replied, oh well, they need to fill out the form. Since that was the case, she would answer everything. He could ask as many questions as he wanted. Ark looked at her silently and said that then she should tell him about her musical background. She replied that she probably started studying when she was 3. My mother played the violin, so the gift was hers, but at the age of 7, she met another teacher and studied with him. Ark asked again, was this teacher from a noble family? She replied that in her country there was no concept of nobility, but her teachers, brothers, and relatives were also musicians, and many famous people among them. He replied that everything was clear. But what awards did she have? Masumi said that she won the violin category at national competitions 5 times and came second once. She also took second place once at an international competition when she was 19. Ark responded that this was impressive. But what happened after that? Masumi replied that there was nothing else. He repeated, nothing. But why? Did she start taking on students? Masumi replied that this was not true. The path to professional music turned out not to be what she had imagined, and she simply couldn't keep up mentally. Then she occasionally played at charity concerts and quietly continued to study. Is that why, when they first met, she said she wasn't a musician? She replied that the problem was that they called themselves violinists, and that their self-definition was different. For example, no matter how many competitions she won, she couldn't live on that alone. Only when people wanted to hear her sound, when someone sought her out, did she become a musician. And Ark said he thought her sound was beautiful enough. Masumi thanked him for this and said that for her, it was a fact. She hadn't been able to create the sound they needed. That was all. Ark filled out the form and said that, frankly, he didn't really care, but her past was simply a requirement for participation in the selection round. Masumi responded abruptly, as if she was trying to help. He replied that he didn't need her past, but the person she was here and now. Masumi was surprised, and he continued saying that he didn't care at all why she wasn't a musician. But her playing had saved them, and anyone in the order would listen to it any day. She understood that his words weren't a lie. She'd spent enough time with him to understand that, but she adjusted her hair and, smiling, looked at Ark. He looked at the clock and said that it was too late. They would continue another time. Masumi replied that she understood and headed for the exit. When she opened the door, she turned around, called his name, and said that his words made her happy. She couldn't yet stand with her head held high, but it was great to talk and get to know each other like this. She understood that he was busy, but suggested that they talk like this occasionally, even if only occasionally. After that, she waved and wished him good night. Ark was left alone and imagined her words that he needed to learn to talk, because she learned something about him that she didn't know before. He leaned back in his chair and said, well, that's it. After a while, he found himself in the common room and said that the country called Japan, where she lived, was quite interesting. There was no nobility here. They didn't use magic. There were educational institutions called schools. There are too many differences from their world here. If there are no schools, does that mean they have private tutors? Private tutors sometimes come to nobles' estates, but for children to gather together and study in one place, he had never heard of such a thing, even in other countries. He continued that he, too, had been taught by a tutor, everything from politics to culture. And Masumi said she understood everything. Under the pretext of preparing her resume, she began talking to Ark privately like this. He asks resume questions, and mostly she just talks about herself. But now, when she reveals a little about herself, for some reason, she feels comfortable. Maybe Ark simply didn't talk about himself before, because he was embarrassed to talk in person. She still doesn't know much about him, but she remembered how pleasant it is to learn something new about a person. After all, she had kept her heart closed for so long. Since she lost those dear to her, she hadn't made any friends or relationships, and even kept her distance from her own father, living alone for many years. And now it was as if she was trying to open that door again. In a world full of new people she was just beginning to get to know. Ark turned to Masumi and asked if everything was okay. Afterwards she apologized, saying she was just thinking, nothing serious. At that moment, Casimirias entered their office, apologizing for interrupting their conversation, but a visitor had arrived who wanted to meet. Ark asked again, now, but it seemed he had no appointments. Masumi said that she would then go back to her room, so as not to disturb. Casimirias replied no, it was a girl who wanted to meet not with Ark, but with the musician of the azure sky. She had come to accompany her. They all sat down at the table, and she began drinking tea. Despite the sudden visit, she thanked the guard commander for responding so quickly. Casimirias replied that it was his responsibility, and Masumi thought, even he was nervous. It must be someone very important. Ark said they were both busy people and suggested keeping things brief. Did the head of the court musicians personally come for his musician? Had he understood correctly? The lady musician of the Azure Sky has a rotating schedule until the qualifying round, serving not only as a personal musician, but also as a court musician. Ark replied that he refused this, as a personal musician's job was limited to supporting their commander. Why should she perform the duties of a court musician? The girl replied that in that case, he would be disqualified from participating in the tournament. Was that acceptable? They considered this, and Masumi looked around questioningly. Ark said that previously, there had been no such requirement for participants. She had already received Alberich citizenship. That should be sufficient. The girl replied that due to the increasing number of espionage cases, the stable situation, and since this year, video confirmation, that the participant was not a dangerous person. He asked again if this right applied to all participants or just his musician. The girl told him not to worry, as appropriate measures would be applied to the others as well. He asked again, but who came up with this rule? If they can't name names, then the rules are invalid. They're just the words of someone unwilling to take responsibility. She replied that it was the decision of the head of the Palace Knights. Ark cursed when he heard this and stood up abruptly, saying that no matter how much he explained, they still continued to suspect her. And by doing so, they were insulting not only him but the music that had saved him. The girl replied that even if he was the commander-in-chief, the head of the Palace Knight's decision could not be reversed. If he didn't agree, his participation was cancelled. Suddenly he said, "Enough." Once again, the Fourth Knightly Order considered this all null and void because of him. He would speak with the Palace Knights himself. She should leave for now, but Masumi suddenly shouted at him to wait. She grabbed his sleeve and said she could handle everything, and if it was a prerequisite, then she agreed. Ark asked again, what was she talking about? They were simply underestimating her abilities. She replied that they didn't know the truth, and if simply working in two places was enough to dispel their doubts, it was a small price to pay. Ark thought for a moment and said nothing, after which Masumi thanked him for getting angry on her behalf and for appreciating her violin. She didn't care if her abilities were underestimated, but she didn't like it when people who believed in her were looked down on. Ark looked at her silently, and she thought about how her music no longer belonged to her alone. She sat down opposite the girl and asked, so, what should she do? After a while, Masumi followed the girl, who informed her that this was the court musician's corp. Masumi entered and saw many girls and boys in similar attire. She was surprised at how large it was. Even though it's the same palace, the atmosphere is completely different from the administrative building where she was last time. She was told to introduce herself as a musician of the Azure Sky. Masumi answered, yes, and clutching her suitcase, she said her name. She serves as the personal musician of the Commander-in-Chief of the Fourth Knightly Order, and to qualify for the combat music tournament, she will serve at the palace as a court musician until the tournament itself. Let them take care of her. After that, she bowed, and those around her began to wonder, is this the one? She looks quite ordinary. She is from the Fourth Knightly Order. Now they need to get down to business. The night's banquet will be held tomorrow evening, and a request for musical accompaniment has been received. In addition to Masumi, Gaudi and Leftera have been appointed. They must prepare. The banquet begins at 6 p.m. Here are the sheet music for the commissioned pieces. Masumi was surprised by this name and looked around, surprised that it would be tomorrow evening. Suddenly, someone called her name, and turning around, she realized it was Grace. She asked why she suddenly decided to work as a court musician. Masumi replied that upon hearing the name, she wondered if it really was her. Suddenly, one of the girls standing behind her blurted out who she saw, their annoying mistress, the musician of the Azure Sky. She seemed to have become very close to this third-rate girl. Her name was Leftera, and it was a great honor for her to perform with them. She understood that she was busy and juggling her job as their personal musician, but she should at least try not to drag them down. Okay? After these words, she bumped her shoulder with Masumi's and moved on. Masumi turned around, and Grace asked if she was hurt. She replied that everything was fine and thanked her for her concern, after which she realized how obvious this was. Masumi recalled Ark's face and thought she was accepting this challenge. At that moment, Serge saw them, turned around and shouted, Masumi! He heard her heading to the court musician's quarters, but returned surprisingly quickly. She noted that she had already returned, and Serge asked again what a court musician was doing here. She replied that circumstances had developed. Starting today, she would be working as a court musician every morning, so they decided to rehearse a little together. He replied that everything was clear. By the way, the commander-in-chief looked rather irritated. Was this related to the head of the Palace Knights? She replied that, as always, he had hit the nail on the head. After all, she had only recently become a musician, and already there were so many problems. She replied that everything was fine. Since they had issued a challenge, it meant she should accept it. Serge was surprised by this attitude and said that if he could help in any way, he should just say so. He knew little about music, but he would help as much as he could. She thanked him for these words, and after a while found herself in the room and said she thought this space was quite sufficient for rehearsal. Grace replied that yes, there was plenty of room here, after which she took out her chest and violin. Masumi was surprised. It was completely white, very beautiful. Grace noticed her gaze and asked if she was seeing Willard for the first time. She replied no, she had seen it before at the West End, but it was so dim then that she couldn't really see it. Masumi asked if she could touch it. She replied of course, as she thought it was bigger and heavier than a violin. The 5 strings resembled the medieval ancestor of the violin. She paused and asked if something had happened. She exclaimed, "No, nothing, please forgive her." She simply thought that she needed to try hard to prepare for the performance with unfamiliar instruments and melodies by tomorrow evening. How many pieces were there? About 10? Grace replied, no, more. And Masumi asked, 20. Grace answered in a trembling voice, no, 32. When Masumi saw that number, she froze and exclaimed. Although half of them were well-known pieces required for musicians, she didn't know them. If she could help with anything, like reading music or anything else, let her ask. Masumi realized she'd have to give it her all, otherwise she wouldn't make it. The court musicians had to be immediately entrusted with the performance for tomorrow evening, after a tough job. She replied that this usually didn't happen, and besides, the head musician probably knew about her situation, so she wouldn't usually be assigned the job so suddenly. Grace asked again, then why? She thought for a moment and realized, is that so? But suddenly Masumi saw her face and asked, what's wrong? She apologized for being lost in thought, and they suggested that they start rehearsing, and Masumi would count on her. Grace looked at her hopefully, but then despairingly, and said, yes. After a while, they continued playing. Masumi watched in surprise and wrote down all the notes so she could quickly learn them. Suddenly, she exclaimed that everything was ready and thanked Grace. She had played for her so many times, thanks to her. She had copied out the entire score. Grace replied that she was glad to help. Perhaps they could take a break. She replied, no. It was her turn to play the notes. She couldn't read the local music, so she asked her to play so she could write them down. But this was only preparation for the rehearsal, and she had no time to rest. Grace replied that this was true, but she must be tired from playing non-stop. Grace replied, not at all. She would keep her company. She really enjoyed rehearsing with her, Miss Masumi. Masumi was happy about this, and said that they should continue then. They were short on time. They needed to be in the hall an hour before the start, then bathe, put on makeup, and change into a dress. They should have everything finished by the following evening. Masumi was surprised and asked again, why such complications? Wouldn't the uniform be suitable? Grace replied that to restore magic, this was quite enough for a banquet where the masters of the knightly orders gather, and it was customary for them to come in evening attire. Masumi replied that she had suddenly mentioned a dress, and she didn't even know what to wear. Grace told her not to worry about it, because the order would prepare everything and deliver the outfit right to her room. She was surprised, really, and then thought, I wonder what kind of outfit it was? Probably just a uniform with a bunch of decorations, like arcs. Grace turned to her and asked if they would continue rehearsing. She answered yes. On the day of the knightly orders banquet, Ark looked out the window and thought Masumi had just been appointed to the court musicians and immediately dragged to the night's banquet. Obviously, there was some ulterior motive behind this. He needed to be on guard so they didn't play some dirty trick on her. He approached Masumi and asked if she was ready. It was time for them to move. She answered in a trembling voice that she was ready. She needed to mentally prepare herself. He asked again, what was she talking about? He'd be right there. When he entered the room, he saw her in a beautiful, form-fitting dress, and she turned to him, embarrassed, blushing. He was dumbfounded when he saw her like that, and she yelled that she knew it wouldn't work. She was so embarrassed, she was burning with awkwardness. Ark replied that everything looked great, but was there something wrong with the dress? She yelled, absolutely not. There are no sleeves, no collar, and that neckline bothers her. It would be fine if it were just a ball gown, but why is it so revealing? Ark replied that in his opinion, it was a completely ordinary style. She yelled that for him it might be ordinary, but she wasn't used to it. Even at competitions, she didn't wear such revealing dresses. She could understand the lack of sleeves so as not to interfere with her performance, but she could at least somehow cover her breasts. For someone who complains so loudly, she still wore it. She could refuse, even if she didn't like it so much. She didn't know what to say, and realized she'd flatly refused. She'd said she'd rather come in uniform, even if it meant looking like a black sheep. But the maid who'd brought the dress declared that if the musician for the Azure Sky didn't wear it, Master Ark's reputation would suffer. Since she'd become his personal musician, she was obliged to always look befitting her position. She replied that she understood her embarrassment, but please let her understand her position. How could she refuse after those words? Ark leaned toward her and said that when he'd made her his personal musician in Westdorf, he'd sworn to care for and protect her, but in reality, he was only making her suffer. An awkward silence ensued, and she said she was genuinely confused and uncomfortable. But she wasn't forcing herself. She decided to see this through, so he shouldn't underestimate her. Ark offered her his hand and said he'd walk her to the hall and that they needed to go. Then Masumi arrived with Ark in a beautiful dress, and as they approached the central gate, Ark announced that he needed to go to headquarters, and that she would go alone from there. She asked again, still holding his hand, "Really?" After that, she let go and said okay, and Ark silently walked back. Even though everything hadn't gone according to plan, he was eagerly awaiting her performance. Ark wished her luck and told her to show them what the Fourth Order's personal musician could do. Masumi smiled at him and said yes, he should look forward to it. Ark watched her go, and Masumi entered the hall alone. When she entered, Grace immediately noticed her and said she'd been waiting for her. Was she lost? Masumi replied that Ark walked her a bit, so everything was fine. Was she late? Grace replied that everything was just on time. At that moment, Masumi noticed something was wrong and whispered in Grace's ear, "Will that instrument be playing today too?" She replied that it was the large Willard and that it played the bass parts. A guy sat and played the instrument, and Masumi thought it was the spitting image of a cello. In that case, all the musicians were assembled and it was time for them to get ready. The guy offered his hand to Mrs. Masumi and said that she was performing first, so she should sit here. She replied, "Okay, thank you," and sat down on a chair, thinking that the cue was going according to some list. The girl standing next to her was angry that she was performing second, and the maid announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, musicians, the banquet will begin soon." They replied that they understood everything. One of the musicians whispered in the ear of his neighbor that the musician of the azure sky had been brought into the work quite quickly, a rare occurrence. She remained silent and didn't respond, then suddenly clenched her fists. She apologized and said that she begged Miss Masumi's pardon. She forgot to give her something. At that moment, she abruptly stood up from her seat, and the same girl told her to sit down immediately. How shameful to be a musician who still isn't ready to perform. She apologized to Miss Leftera, but asked for another minute. Leftera looked her in the eye with anger and started shouting, "Grace," and at that moment, Masumi said that everything was fine. Thank her. She was glad she was so worried about her. But the truth was, everything was fine now, and she had nothing else to worry about. A moment later, they all sat in silence, and Masumi thought that she probably just wanted to show her the newbie how things worked, and teach her a lesson. But no matter how much they picked on her, she decided that she could handle it, and everything would be fine. With these thoughts in mind, she continued to prepare for the event. Suddenly, the gates to the room opened, and a young man entered, immediately noticing Masumi. One of them was Ark, who smiled as he looked into her eyes. Masumi, looking at the same man, realized he was the Grand Master of the Court Order. He glanced at her briefly, then immediately turned away. He then sat back down and said, "Well then, he suggests we begin the order's reports." At that moment, the first musician began to play his melody. Nightly order reports are held monthly, where the orders report on their budgets and achievements. During the banquet, the musicians must play without interrupting conversations. They are required to play without stopping. Even at concerts or weddings, there are always breaks, but at this banquet, resting is strictly forbidden, and anyone who lacks skill could simply fail. It was truly hard for Masumi to admit it. She'd already lost count of how many songs they'd played. The banquet continued, and the table was laden with delicious dishes. One of the musicians had already tired of playing a melody, and Masumi suddenly wondered if that was it. The master asked if there were any more reports. Everyone exchanged silent glances, and he smiled and said that if not, they would move on to the debut last. Masumi was surprised. A debut? He turned to her and said, "Musician of the azure sky, who is she, and is she a true musician? Let her prove it right now. After all, that's why she was called here." When the whole hall heard this, Ark and Masumi were stunned with horror, saddened and uneasy. Grace closed her eyes in shame. At that moment, Ark immediately jumped up and started shouting, "What kind of review is this?" She'd already proven her skill more than once. Masumi had honestly passed the selection process and was preparing for the martial music festival, but his ridiculous order forced her to appear here as a court musician. What more did he want from her? The master replied that in such unstable times, he was the one who suddenly dragged in a personal musician with a dubious past. He should have foreseen this turn of events. Ark cursed, and the master continued to say that they had never been shown her true abilities. The order masters were gathered here, and the musicians were capable of appreciating her talent, so let her play right now. And if they didn't recognize her talent, it was entirely possible that she was a spy from the other side, planted in their ranks. At that moment, the hall fell silent, and Masumi became deeply embarrassed, then changed her attitude and told them to ignore her and just continue. He asked again, "What's so funny?" Masumi replied, "Well, he's just trying so hard that she couldn't even resist." And why did they continue to plot so persistently? She was very surprised. She'd heard the situation in Olmarek was complicated and understood their concerns about a stranger with an unknown past. She, in turn, had complied with all their demands, so Ark had done everything to ensure her status. And yet that wasn't enough for them? Turning around, she realized she'd sensed this before the banquet, and tried to warn her. Now she understood everything, and they were only persistently picking on her to spite Ark. They didn't like him, so they were looking for any excuse to criticize him, and she was just a convenient target. Had he really been suffering this all alone? Time after time, He'd endured these fits at court, where he had so few allies, completely alone. So all she could do for him now was just that. Suddenly she rose from her seat and asked, so he wanted her to prove herself to them? The master said that if she considered herself worthy of the title of Musician of the Azure Sky, then of course she could refuse, and he wouldn't object. Masumi asked again. He was asking about the Azure Sky? She immediately picked up the violin and said whether she was worthy or not was not for her to decide, and certainly not for him. She dedicated this composition to the Commander-in-Chief of the Fourth Knightly Order. Ark stood up when he heard these words, and Masumi began playing Johann Sebastian Bach's Chaconne. When Ark's name was mentioned in conjunction with the Azure Sky, she immediately knew she would play this. This theme may seem melancholic and sad, but in the middle, it undergoes a dramatic change, like early morning after a raging storm all night. Like the quiet light of dawn breaking through the clouds, each note is striking in its pure beauty, and then chords sounded, like a sun blazing ever brighter, resonating in the very heart. Ark watched Masumi play with loving eyes. This music was far from the lush splendor of an orchestra, but this prayer, rising in proud solitude, eventually reached the very depths of the soul. After some time, she thought that they had finally returned to the estate of the Fourth Order, but what a crazy day it had been. This star must be first magnitude. In this world, the arrangement of stars was so different that she didn't even recognize the constellation here. She thought Ark would be angry again, but he was suspiciously quiet. Because of this, she smiled when she looked into his eyes, and when they reached the right place, she waved and thanked him for seeing her off. Was he going to go back to his office and continue working? She'd find her way there on her own, but before she could finish, Ark suddenly grabbed her hand and said no, he'd go with her and walk her all the way to her room. She was surprised and started screaming. Why? He was busy, after all. He told her not to argue and pulled her hand along with him. Did she really think he was capable of thinking about work in such a state? Masumi stared at him in surprise and silently followed him. When they paused, he asked again, but how could she maintain such a calm expression? She asked again, what was he talking about? He continued that at the end of the banquet, she was ordered to play like a musician of the Azure Sky, his personal musician. Had the head of the musicians warned her about this in advance? Masumi replied, no, nothing, and he replied that he had thought so. According to the rules, the court order should have first coordinated this with him, the commanders-in-chief of the Fourth Order, and only then could the head of the musicians inform her. So what happened there was unthinkable. She wasn't just a musician, she was his personal ward. Forcing her to play without his permission was a gross abuse of power. Moreover, it was the greatest insult to her. She suspected it was a setup, but it seemed the guy was acting even more insolently than she thought. Ark looked into the distance with a confident expression, and Masumi noticed it and asked, is that why he's so angry? Did she do something wrong? Ark continued to hold her hand and replied, no, it's not that. Even when they insulted her so openly, he couldn't protect her and forced her to go through the ordeal again. He should have simply cut them down on the spot. Why was he so pathetic? But instead, the melody she dedicated to him wouldn't leave his head, and his heart was still pounding. Ark lowered his gaze and asked, what should he do at times like this? He became very embarrassed, and they looked at each other in silence for a while, when suddenly, Masumi began to laugh sharply. Ark looked at her in bewilderment, and she continued laughing. He asked why she was suddenly acting like that. She replied that he seemed so impulsive, but in reality, he was so preoccupied. She grabbed his hand with both of hers and said that in moments like these, he could just be genuinely happy. Let him forget about everything bad. She suggested they eat something delicious instead, and he could just laugh and say, serves them right. A smile appeared on his face, and he said that maybe then they could drink the wine he'd been saving today. Masumi replied that that was an excellent idea. It seemed she'd never properly drank alcohol before. He replied that that was good, and then he'd order snacks. After a while, the master knocked on the door and said, Your Highness, this is Hinty. Hasn't he eaten anything today either? Inside the room, a young man was sitting on the bed. This was the prince of the Albaric Empire, Teodoash Albalevi Canova. A silence passed between them, and Hinty said, by the way, he'd soon introduce him to a new musician. She's from the Fourth Knightly Order. She'd even been invited to the Order's recent banquets, and she seems talented. Perhaps she could be of use to him, Your Highness. Well, now he'll go. The boy trembled and asked, Fourth Order, Ark Order? He rose from his seat, looked out the window, and said it would be a waste of time anyway. Let them leave him alone. Several days had passed since that crazy Knightly Order banquet. Her relationship with Ark had improved, and they even sometimes had drinks together in the evenings. Daily life had become quite peaceful. And yet, for some reason, she found herself back in that hall in the palace with the other musicians. Or had she said they weren't leaving? What had she said? Grace stood there, perplexed, silently pressing her hand to her heart. She then said that no rehearsal room could be assigned to a specific person, and that this rule applied to all musicians without exception. She couldn't do whatever she wanted here, Miss Leftera. Leftera started shouting, What kind of tone is that? She didn't dare speak to her with such arrogance, you worthless thing. Masumi was dumbfounded when she heard these statements and reflected on what she'd recently realized about factions among musicians. There were those like Grace, talented but lacking in status, and those whose abilities weren't so high to begin with. The latter group, like Leftera, had both talent and status, and had taken advantage of the fact that people like Grace never fought back. But with her arrival among the committed musicians, the situation had changed. Now Grace and the others had begun to assert their rights, and this was making them very angry. Masumi considered whether her intervention had made them feel threatened, and she could understand Leftera's feelings. But they had occupied this space first, and if she wasn't satisfied with the rehearsal room assignments, she should complain to the head of the musicians. Leftera began shouting, "What impudence! Do you really intend to stay here ignoring this lady?" Masumi wondered which lady they were talking about. It turned out to be Cheryl Salmera, the deputy head of the court musicians of the Knightly Order. Leftera continued to shout at the lady that she wasn't just the deputy head of the court musicians, she had a most important mission, and she was the personal musician of the commander of the Royal Guard. If the lady needed to rehearse, they were obliged to give her the space. That was obvious. Cheryl aggressively responded that she was well aware of the importance of her mission, but that didn't give her the right to treat them with disdain. Leftera began to shout and not act arrogantly, but at that moment, Cheryl told her to stop. Let Grace listen to her. As long as there are mediocrities like her here, their musicians will continue to be lumped together. Their readiness to serve in the army doubted. She hadn't forgotten that, had she? Grace looked sadly at the fervor and didn't know what to say. Masumi mused that she might be even worse than Leftera, even though they were from the same faction. This wasn't just a fight for territory. She seemed absurdly proud of her profession, hiding behind ideals of what a true musician should be. Masumi watched them silently and suddenly exclaimed, "Listen. After all, mediocrity isn't a word you throw around so easily." Cheryl grinned when she saw her and said, "So she is that musician of the azure sky everyone's talking about." She'd heard that she didn't even really know anything about Alberic. What right did she have to interfere here? Masumi replied that the fact that she wasn't from here had absolutely nothing to do with it. She was talking about basic human dignity. Aren't they being too arrogant? She replied that she was merely stating a fact. They still lacked a great deal. Masumi said that since she was saying that, she was proposing that they settle the matter once and for all. Whoever could restore the most magic with their playing should be judged by an independent judge. That way, they'd immediately understand who was the superior musician, right? Cheryl looked at her in surprise and replied that she accepted the challenge. As they left the hall, Masumi stretched and said, and while she'd certainly announced the challenge loudly, who would she ask to be the judge? After she issued the challenge, Cheryl laid down the rules. The gist of it was that each of them must bring one holy knight as a judge. Then they would exchange their chosen compositions, play them, and see who could restore the most magic. But it would take place in 3 hours in her office, and she would have preferred to hold it in the musician's wing, but there were no available rooms. She agreed because it seemed the most obvious method, but she hadn't thought about who to ask to be the judge. So she turned to Grace and asked who she thought would be suitable. Grace didn't know what to say and thought for a long time. Masumi reflected that she was still tormented by that incident. At the Order's banquet, Grace had guessed the master of the court knight's plan, and seemed to be tormented by her conscience for not warning her, deciding to save herself. Since then, she's tried not to look her in the eye. She shouldn't be so upset about it. Grace said that if we were talking about the amount of magic restored, the commander-in-chief would be best suited. Thanks to their contract as a personal musician, the amount restored would be higher. She asked again, "Really?" Grace replied that Lady Cheryl would certainly bring the Holy Knight, with whom she had a contract, the commander of the Royal Guard. But in general, Miss Masumi, the commander-in-chief, isn't a Holy Knight, so he doesn't meet the conditions. Masumi replied, "Yes, indeed," and pondered what it meant, meaning, without the bonus of an excellent contract, she'd have to defeat Cheryl, who would bring her knight and patron. It would be quite difficult, and she was upset. After that, she turned to Grace and said she wanted her to invite someone. Would she do that for her? Grace replied, "Yes, if there's anything she can do." And Masumi thanked her for it, then whispered in her ear, "In that case." When she finished, Grace was surprised. Afterward, Masumi put her drawer on the table and said that now all that remained was to choose a song. Recently, thanks to Grace, she'd become much more knowledgeable about local music and was already quite adept at playing famous tunes from the so-called compulsory course. But she only learned to play them to read Albaric music, and she has to mentally translate their familiar staff, so she's unlikely to be able to sight-read them perfectly. She knows full well she's not strong in local music, so she set the terms for the exchange of compositions. Plus, there's the bonus of restoring an excellent contract. She can't afford to relax. She's using everything she has for this. Suddenly, Isel entered her room and said, A magic restoration duel. What happened this time? Masumi thanked him for agreeing to come. Grace approached him and apologized for distracting him, but she couldn't ignore it. Otherwise, it could all lead to big problems. Miss Grace briefly outlined the situation and she doubted her judging would have any impact on the outcome. But that was understandable. But if it came down to it, it would be better to ask someone she knew. It would be safer that way, right? He was surprised that Masumi had acted this way, and at that moment, Hinty entered their office and asked, "Is this the room of the Azure Sky Musician?" Masumi was surprised and said, "Yes, she is the Azure Sky Musician, Masumi. Is he by any chance Ms. Cheryl's patron?" He replied that it was indeed so. He was the commander of the Royal Guard, Hinty. He said it seemed his musician had made some rather absurd demands, but she replied that she should thank him and hope for a fair judgment. Cheryl, standing behind him, was suspiciously quiet. Because of this, Hinty blurted out that the Grey family's white lily, what was such an unattainable flower doing in such a place? They hadn't seen each other in a long time, and she was on friendly terms with the musician of the Azure Sky. He was surprised, really. The Order of Mages would probably be furious, and they were so desperate to keep her, and she slipped away so easily. Grace replied that she had no contracts with them, so she had the right to do so, and Hinty confirmed that this was fair. If she had agreed, he would have offered her a contract himself. At that moment, Grace was very surprised by these words, and Cheryl was dumbfounded. She suddenly began to shout, "Master Hinty, tell him to stop these jokes." He replied that she was right. He was asking for forgiveness. Masumi noticed this and thought that this was probably the most ordinary small talk, but the way her face twitched was surprising. Could Cheryl's harsh attitude towards Grace have something to do with this? At that moment, he apologized for the Order's musicians causing them trouble during such a busy time, and he replied that it was no big deal. After all, it was his personal musician's request after all, and Cheryl thanked him. At that moment, they exchanged glances and agreed to begin their duel.